Welcome to Vue.js Simplified. This is a compilation of a previously published series. What you're about to watch is 15 chapters that walk you through the essentials of building a web interface with Vue. As you follow along, be sure to check out the video description for a set of notes that accompanies each chapter. And with that, let's get started. Welcome to video number 1 of Vue.js Simplified. In this series, we're going to walk through working with the JavaScript framework Vue.js. Along the way, we're going to learn by doing. So we're going to put together this application I'm calling FlashWord. It's a game or a practice utility for learning vocabulary in a different language. So you can see you're presented with a series of words and you're tasked with typing in the translation. And if you get it correct, it turns green. It keeps track of how many words you've guessed correct. You can reset it. And we could also imagine how we expand this, perhaps a way to like shuffle the words or pin words that you're having a hard time with, you want to focus on. Maybe we could adapt it to pull in different languages. There's lots of fun things we could do with this. And so this, like I said, will be our example that will guide us on this journey to learning about Vue.js. Now, in this first video, before we get into writing any Vue.js, I want to talk a bit about what Vue.js is and why you might want to use it. And to do that, we really have to contextualize things. We have to talk about the technologies that come together to make websites. And to have this discussion, I have this diagram here. You can think of this as like all the puzzle pieces that go into websites. And I want to look at the flow of how websites are delivered and how those technologies work together to make it happen. So starting here with the browser itself, of course, this is the tool in which we view websites. So a user might type in a URL for our site or follow a link to our site. And when they do that, a request is made to our server that is hosting that site. And the server is going to do whatever processing it needs to do to respond to that request. And it might be as simple as just pulling up an HTML file that's on a server and returning it. Or it might be dynamically pulling together content from, say, a database, merging that in within a template of some sort, and that gets returned. Regardless of how it's doing it, it's going to return some response. And typically that response is at minimum going to contain HTML and CSS. So of course, HTML is going to be the structure of the page. It's going to say, okay, here's the heading, here's the navigation, here's some links, here's an image. It's going to lay all of that out. And then layered on top of that, we'll have CSS for the style that's going to dictate how things look. And with that, everything I just described is the ingredients for a very classic and traditional website where we go to a URL, the server processes it, a response is returned, the browser will then render that response. And to the extent we continue to interact with that site, say we click links to go to different pages on that site, that whole process will happen again, where we make a full request to the server will generate a response, and then we'll see that response re-rendered in the browser. To visualize a real-world example of this, I always like to pull up Wikipedia, just because it's such a classic website in that it's not this bells and whistles interactive site. It's mostly just like text and images and information. And we can browse around this site. We can, click links and jump from page to page. And every time we're doing that, that cycle of talking to the server to regenerate the page is happening. We're seeing that round trip request to the server. And that process or that model works really well for something like Wikipedia because, it's content-based. We're basically presented with information, and it's not a big deal if we click a link to have to wait for that entire page to refresh to show us the information that we've requested. All right, now compare that, though, to something much more dynamic, something like Google Docs. When I first go to a Google Docs link, we are going to see that initial request to the server, where the server is going to generate our response that's going to get returned and rendered by the browser. But then after that point, it's going to be listening for micro interactions. For example, if I start to type some text, behind the scenes, it's going to be automatically saving my changes as I'm working. If I have a typo in my text, it's going to detect that, and via the interface, it's going to let me know. So visually, it's going to indicate that with this little red squiggly line. I get this little pop-up for handling the spell checking of that. Basically, anything we might do in this interface, it's all just about these micro interactions. And all of that is happening and powered by the third layer that we see in our client-side technologies, which is, of course, JavaScript. JavaScript allows us to create dynamic websites because it gives us a way to manipulate the HTML and the CSS on the page on the fly in reaction to actions from the user. And because we can do that, because we can manipulate the content dynamically, we don't have to rely on that classic model of if we want to see new content, we have to make a whole new request to the server. The server has to return a whole new response that then has to be rendered. Instead, we can shift the responsibility to JavaScript and what's happening in the browser to react to what the user is doing. Now, this doesn't mean that when we shift the responsibility to JavaScript that we don't need the server as much anymore, because there's still many things within web applications that rely upon the server. Things like communicating with a database, talking to third-party merchants if you're doing like monetary transactions. There's many things that the server has to do that we can't do in the client alone with these three technologies. But when that happens, we have a way in JavaScript to communicate with the server. We can send these micro requests to the server that says, hey, get this information from the database, or send this email, or process this credit card transaction. And then the server, rather than responding with a full page response, can just give us back micro responses that JavaScript can then use to update the interface accordingly, letting the visitor know that their action was successful. All right, so long story short, if you want a very interactive experience, you want your website to feel like an application, you're going to be relying heavily on JavaScript. And you could sit down and build your interface using just HTML, CSS, and pure vanilla JavaScript. But you'd spend a lot of time engineering how to do things, right? How to update the interface in the most efficient way, how to manage the interconnected data that is part of your application. You'd have to come up with clear strategies for doing this. Or alternatively, you can pull in a JavaScript framework like Vue.js, which is basically going to give you a pre-existing set of tools for handling all the things you need to do in your interface. And all of this is actually how frameworks like Vue.js evolved. If you look at its predecessors, things like Angular or React, they came out of companies like Google and Facebook, respectively, where you had developers that were starting to build these really robust web interfaces. And they basically said there's got to be a better way where we can streamline this process. Let's put together some tools that handle the common things we need to do on these applications. And that way, as we build more applications, expand our current applications, we can put those tools to use and basically avoid having to reinvent the wheel each time. And of course, because these frameworks are open source and freely available to use, then us as individual developers also don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can put these existing tools to use. All right, so that's the role of a JavaScript framework, to give us some tools to solve common problems and things we need to do within our interfaces. Now, I just mentioned Angular, I mentioned React. I've talked about them as predecessors to Vue.js. I do want to talk a little bit about why Vue.js versus something like Angular or React. And my goal here is not to make a case to try to say that Vue.js is the best framework, because that's something that it depends on so many factors. It depends on personal opinion. Each of the frameworks has their own pros and cons. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on some of Vue's common pros or selling points, starting with the fact that it's approachable. Relative to a lot of other JavaScript frameworks, I find Vue.js to be more beginner friendly. That being said, and as noted here, it's powerful enough to grow. All right, so it's really good and easy to get started off with, but if your application scales up, the needs of your application scales up, Vue can definitely meet those demands. It's also versatile. So if you're in a situation, well, let's say you have an existing application or website, it's more along the lines of like a traditional website where you're doing those full page requests and you want to start to integrate bits of JavaScript interactivity, Vue is really good at that. The same can't be said for other frameworks like, for example, Angular. Angular is much more designed in mind where you're starting the application in Angular and you're building up from there. It's not designed to be sprinkled into an existing site. All right, and then finally, when it comes down to performance, every framework out there is definitely thinking about optimization and trying to be as performant as possible, and Vue.js is no exception. One of the nice things about Vue is it's designed where it has like the core framework, and then if you need to pull on additional features such as things like I mentioned here, routing, state management, all these things we'll talk about later in this series, you can pull them in as you need them, right? So you don't necessarily have to pull in this large monolithic framework just to start with the basics. You can start with the core and kind of expand from there. And all of those things are going to help with performance. So like I said, those are just a few selling points and reasons some people choose and prefer to work with Vue.js. But form your own opinions. Perhaps as you go through the series, periodically check in on the documentation on some of the other frameworks, just to see how what we're doing in Vue.js, how it compares to those other frameworks. Ask around to colleagues, what is their personal opinion? Look at job listings. That'll give you a sense of like the popularity of different frameworks if you're looking or thinking about these things in terms of marketability as a developer. Like I said, there's so many factors involved, not aiming to tackle that and make that argument here. If you're watching this series, I'm already assuming that for whatever reason, you have decided to invest time in learning Vue.js. And so I'm here to guide you on that journey. And with that, that concludes my introduction. And so we're ready for the next steps in this journey. In part 2 of this series, we're going to roll up our sleeves and start to code and work with Vue.js. In part 1 of this series, we got a basic introduction to Vue. So now here in part 2, let's jump in and start to put together an example. To set up this example, I'm just going to create a new directory, and I'm going to call it FlashWord, which is the name of the application we're going to be building in this series. Then within this directory, I'm going to start off with an index file. And then for some starting code, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video. I have a template we can start off with. So I'll just copy this from the notes, paste that in there. And then I will also create a JavaScript file called app.js. And if we take a look at the index file, you can see I've already set a script element here to pull in that external JavaScript file for us. Preceding that, we also have a script element that's pulling in the actual Vue.js framework. And we're getting this from an external CDN or content delivery network, which is good for this starting example. It's just a really quick and easy way to pull in this package into this code base. Later in the series, we will look at things like Node Package Manager, where we can actually download a copy of Vue so it is integrated into our project. But for now, just for this basic example, like I said, this will just allow us to really hit the ground running without having to worry about package management and all of those things. All right, so we've got access to Vue. We've got a place where we can write our own JavaScript that's going to utilize Vue. Following that, I have some basic CSS to style the elements we're going to be working with in this example. And then finally, down in the body of the page, I have some HTML to kick off our application. So let's go ahead and load this. So we've got it open in the browser before we start writing any JavaScript. So I'm just going to go to File, Open File, navigate to the directory where I've written this code, which I've already got it set up here. So you can see it's pointing to that FlashWord directory. And I just want to open this index.html file. And this is exactly what we should be seeing at this point. And so with our example set up, coming back to the code, let's focus on the JavaScript we're going to write. And what we need to do, the way every Vue application starts, is you create a new Vue instance. And often we like to store those instances in a variable or a constant just in case we need to reference it later. So I'm going to create a constant for this, and I'm just going to call it app. And then I'm going to set it to be a new instance of this Vue object. In this Vue object, we have access to this because remember, we are pulling in the Vue.js framework, so it's built into that. And within that object, there's a method we want to invoke called createApp. Now we're going to want to feed this some options to essentially configure our Vue instance. We'll come back to that in a moment, but just to complete this statement, the other thing we want to do after we create the app is we want to attach it to an element on our page. And the way we're going to do that is using a method called mount. And then we're going to give it a selector of the element we want to attach this instance to. And in this case, I want to attach it to this div that I have here with an ID of app. So the selector I'm going to use is, because I'm dealing with an ID, I'm going to use the # and then just the name app. All right, and that's another key thing to understand about working with something like Vue is you create these instances and then you essentially like plug them into your HTML, right? So basically we're saying we want this div to be powered by Vue. All of the functionality that we get with Vue, we're going to want to utilize it within this particular div. That's what we're doing when we're mounting it to that element. So that line creates our Vue instance. And then backing up here, I mentioned we want to give it some options. And this is really where we start to program how this Vue instance is going to work. And the way we're going to give our options is we're going to give it a JavaScript object that's going to have different properties set within that object. And I could write it directly here within the createApp method invocation, but typically what you'll see is you'll create like a whole separate constant with your options, which you'll then pass to createApp. So following that pattern, I would do something like this. I'm just going to create an object. I'll name it after my application. I'll just call it FlashWord. set it up as an empty object, and then that is what I'm going to pass to the create app method. Now, digging into the object, let's start to set up our options for this application. And typically the first option you're going to be dealing with is called the data option. This is where you're going to specify the data points of your application. And the way we need to set this up is we're going to create a function called data, and we're going to have it return an object where we're going to define our data properties. For example, the first data property we want to have is correlated to what I had set up in the template. I had this use of word A. This is going to represent the word that we're trying to get the visitor to translate. So I'll set up a property for that called word A. And just to begin with, I'm just going to hard code the first word that we want to challenge the visitor with. And we'll start real simple. We'll just say hola. And then related to that, we need to know what the translation of that is. And I'll store that under our data property we'll call word B. And that would just be hello. So that's the pattern we're looking at for setting up data properties of our Vue instance. We set them up within this object that's returned from this function called data. We're going to add on to this. There's going to be other data properties we're going to need for the functionality of this. But just to begin with, we're going to start with the word we're asking the visitor to translate and essentially the solution. And with that, I want to check in and actually run this in the browser just to make sure that all of the code I've written here to create this new Vue instance is working without error. So let's go back to the browser and I'm going to refresh my page. And the first thing we should observe is our word A data property is actually being output in our interface here. And the way it's doing that is using a feature within Vue.js called text interpolation. If we go back to our template, the way we text interpolate or output data to the screen is using these double curly brackets on either side of some JavaScript expression. And in this case, our expression is just referencing that word A data property. So Vue will dynamically inject that value right here in this template. So that's going to be pretty useful, but here's where it really starts to get interesting. As we dynamically update this data property, we should see those updates reflected in the interface because a lot of the data we work with in Vue instances is reactive. All right? When we say that data is reactive, it means that if it changes in one place, anywhere else where we're using that data, we're going to see that change reflected. To show you what I mean, let's go back to the browser. And I don't have a way in the interface yet to actually update that word A data property, but I can do it using the web inspector. So to pull that up, I'm just going to right click on the page and go to inspect and then switch over to my console tab. And as you know, if you've worked with JavaScript before, any JavaScript we write in this console will be reflected here on this page in real time. So what I want to do is I want to update that word A data property. And the way I'm going to access the data property is, you'll recall when we created a Vue instance, we set it in a constant called app. So I'm going to start by referencing that. And then to get to the data option that we set up specifically, I'm going to use $data. That's going to reveal all of my underlying data within this Vue instance. And you can see as I type that in, it's actually pre-filling. We could see our object with word A and word B. And I want to reference word A, so I'm going to say word A, and let's go ahead and change it. So I'm going to just change it to another string. We'll change it to adios. All right, then I'll run that, and we can instantly see that reflected in our interface. It dynamically changed because we changed that data property. Now, that might not seem very impressive because we did have to go and do it behind the scenes via the console. Obviously not something we're going to ask our visitors to do. So let's set up an example that does replicate the kind of things our visitors would do, where we can observe this reactive behavior. And to do this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a text input where the user can actually type in their answer. So let's go back to our template. And right below our prompt, let's do an input type text. And what I want to do is I want to essentially attach this text input to one of our data options. And specifically, I'm going to create a new data option to track the answer that the user enters. So let's set that up. We'll just call it answer. And I'll go ahead and initialize it as an empty string, just because when we first load this Vue instance, we don't have an answer yet. We don't know what it is. So we'll start out with an empty string. And then once I've set up that data option, coming back to my input, I'm going to add what is called the Vue directive. And the first Vue directive we want to look at is the model directive. And the syntax is going to look like this. It's going to be v-model. And then we're going to set it to some value. And in this case, I want to model this input after my answer data property. So I'm simply going to set it to be answer. So what we're doing here is we're effectively binding this input to this data option. Just to see this, let's also use the answer as just like a basic output on the page. So I'll just have a paragraph that says you answered. And then again, using our text interpolation syntax, that double mustache syntax, we're going to output the answer data property. All right, so now we've got one data property that we're using in two different places. One, we're binding it via the vModel directive to this input, and we're also text interpolating it or outputting it to the page. So saving those changes, coming back to the browser, let's refresh it. And on initial page load, we see an empty input and we don't see anything for the answer. And this makes sense because remember, when we set up that data property answer, we set it to be an empty string. But now let's change it. And the way I'm going to change it is I'm just going to enter my answer in this text input. So I'll enter hello. And you'll see every character I type is dynamically changing that. And then down here where we're outputting it, we're seeing that reflected here, right? Because both of these things are tied to that answer data property. If I delete it, it goes away. If I type it out, it shows up again. If I bring up my console, make another change here. So I'll just hit the up arrow to bring my last change. This time, instead of changing word A, I'm going to change answer. And just as an example, I'll just set it to ABC. What we should see is it's going to update our input and our output on the page. And again, it's because we've created like a dependency of these elements on that data property, and it's all reactive. If something changes to that data property, it will react here. We will see those changes reflected. Moving on, let's optimize this example. I think it would be ideal if when we first loaded the page, we actually didn't see this text that said you answered because we don't know what the answer is yet, so we shouldn't see that. And the way I'm going to handle that, coming back to my template, is I'm going to use another Vue directive. This time I'm going to use the if directive. And just like our vModel, it's going to start off with v dash. All of our directives we're going to work with in Vue, they always start with v dash something. In this case, it's v if. And the value I'm going to set here is a Boolean expression that if it evaluates to true, this paragraph element will be rendered on the page. If it doesn't, if it evaluates to false, we just won't see this in our document. So the Boolean expression I'll use for this is I'm going to look at that answer data property, and I'm going to say if it's not equal to an empty string, then we should go ahead and render this paragraph on the page. So again, let me save those changes, come back, refresh our interface, and there we go. We're not seeing that text yet until we actually start to type in an answer. And then once we do, then it gets rendered. And this is going to be a really important tool because anytime we're building interactive interfaces, it's often just about hiding or showing content depending on different conditions. And using the directive like vif allows us to do that. And later we'll see how in addition to vif, there's also things like velse, velse if, all of those combinations we are typically accustomed when it comes to conditionals in programming. We can use them here in our Vue interfaces as well. Moving on, another important directive I want to sample in this example is a vOn directive, which will allow us to listen for specific actions from the user. For example, we will probably want to have a button as part of this interface that the user can click to check their answer. And what we want to do with this button is we want to listen for when the visitor clicks it. So we're going to use the vOn directive, and we're going to follow that up with an argument. Arguments are just ways we can pass extra configuration to our directives. In this case, the argument we want is what is the action that we're listening for here? And in this case, it's going to be a click. And then for the value I'm going to set this to is some JavaScript that I want to execute when they click this button. So thinking through this, the JavaScript that we're going to need to execute is to check their answer to see if it matches word B, which is the word that we're looking for. So to do this, first of all, I'm going to create a new data property. Let's call it correct. And this will ultimately have a Boolean value of true or false as to whether they got it correct. We will initialize it though as just as a null value because when we first come to the page, we don't know if it's correct. Then coming back to our click listener, we're going to update correct. And we're going to set it to be either true or false, depending on whether their answer matches word B. So we could write that simply as a Boolean expression. We're just going to say word B, and we're going to use the comparison operator to see if word B is equivalent to the answer. And if that is true, then correct will be true. Otherwise, correct will be false. Then below our button, we can produce some output using that correct data property. So let's have like a paragraph that says, you got it. That's what we'll display if they got it correct. Otherwise, we'll have another paragraph that says, sorry, please try again. And then we'll sprinkle in some Vue directives to decide which of these paragraphs to display. So the first one will display if correct is true. Otherwise, and we'll use the velse directive, this paragraph will display. Now this will work as expected once we've set correct to be either true or false, once we click this button. Before that though, when correct is null on initial page load, what'll happen is this paragraph will actually display, right? Because it'll look at this one and say, okay, well, correct isn't true, so it's not going to display this, but it will display this. And that's not what we want. We don't want to give them negative feedback right from the get-go. So one way we could address this, we could actually expand this to a v-else if, and we could look that the correct value is not equal to null. So that essentially covers our three cases. Case number one, we first come to the page, correct is null. We won't see this. We also won't see this. Case number two is we click the button, now correct is either true, in which case we'd see this, or case number three, we've clicked the button, correct is false, then we would see this. And let's just go ahead and test that, show that quickly. So coming back to our application, I'm just going to refresh it. And as you can see, I don't see any feedback when we first load the page. But if I type in an answer and click check answer, we get our positive feedback. Whereas if I type in an incorrect answer, we get our negative feedback. So that's working as expected, but I think it would be clearer if we were a little bit more explicit here. And what if we just took our feedback that we're giving and wrap it in a div that would conditionally display whether or not it's time to give feedback? Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to create a div that we will conditionally display, and I'll come up with another data property. Let's anticipate that we'll call it show feedback, right? If that's true, then one of our paragraphs of feedback will display, right? And then we don't need this extra if here. We could just simply use this as an else in combination with this v-if. All right, and then the show feedback data property, we'll initialize that on page load as false. We don't want to show any feedback when the page first loads, but then coming back to our click listener, we'll add on to our current expression and we'll update show feedback to be true. And let's just go ahead and test this quick, make sure it's working as expected. All right, so here's initial page load. We don't see any feedback. We enter a correct guess. We click our button. We got our positive feedback. And then we enter an incorrect guess, click our button again, and we see our try again feedback. So the end result is the same, but I just think that this approach is a little bit clearer. It's more explicit as to what's going on. And this idea of creating data properties that act almost as toggle switches for parts of your interface is something that you're going to use a lot as you're working with Vue. So this was a good opportunity to take a look at that technique. And just to put some finishing touches on this, I do have some CSS I had included as part of the template for our correct and incorrect feedback. So I'm going to add those classes to our paragraphs. So now if we test this again, we enter a correct answer, we should get green feedback, and then an incorrect answer should yield red feedback. So it looks like that's in good working order. And now that it is working, I do want to rewind a little bit to this JavaScript expression that I wrote here to respond to this click event. What I've done here, I've got two parts of this expression. The first one that is updating correct, and the second one is updating show feedback. And for something as simple as that, to write it in line here with our button itself is not a big deal, but you can imagine that the things we're going to want to do in responses to things like clicks can start to get more complex than this. We might have 3, 4, 10 different lines of JavaScript we need to execute when a button is clicked. And so when that starts to happen, it makes sense to take this JavaScript logic and outsource it to a method that we can add to our Vue options. And this actually brings us to another option we can give to our Vue instances. In addition to our data, we can also have a methods option. So I'm going to tack this on. We're just going to call it methods, and we're going to set it to be an object of different methods we want to use in this application. So the first method I'm going to create, let's call it check answer. And what we want to happen in here is the same thing we were doing inline. In fact, I'm just going to cut this out of there, move it over to our JavaScript. All right, now that we're here, we can bump each statement to its own line. And the other thing we need to do now that we're working within this object context is we need to prefix each of our data properties with the keyword this, basically indicating that we're talking to properties of this current instance. If we didn't do this, it would just treat these properties as if they were local variables of this method. Now, this step wasn't necessary when we were referencing our data properties in our template, and that's just because how the template is processed, it's not necessary to include this there. Basically, when the Vue instance is mounted to this template, it's going to be implied that we're referencing the data properties of this instance. So now that we've got our check answer method all set up, let's set that to be what's invoked when we click on this button. And let's go ahead and test it out. Looks good. I'll enter an incorrect answer. Perfect. And with that, we have a pretty good rudimentary start to our FlashWord application that we could build upon in this series. Before I wrap up this video, though, I do want to address, you may have noticed every time I refresh the application, there's this like momentary blip where we see all the content of our template on the page. And to show this, I'm just going to rapidly refresh it a few times in a row so you can really see that happening. All right, that's not ideal. What's going on there is if we look back at our template, we have several elements of content here, things like the paragraph where we show the answer, the div where we show the feedback, which once Vue is loaded, those things are going to be obscured. But what's happening is when this page is first loaded, it's just HTML that's getting rendered, right? Before JavaScript comes in, there's nothing that turns this paragraph off or turns this div off. And that's what we're seeing there. We're just seeing that momentary second when that content's there. But then once the JavaScript is loaded, once our Vue instance is mounted, it obscures that. So the end result is our interface looks as expected, but it's just a little sloppy to have to see that blip of content happen. And so one way to address that is Vue has a feature they called cloaking, where you can essentially cloak the application until the Vue instance is mounted, at which point it will show the content. To implement cloaking, what we have to do is we want to go to our the div or whatever element we're mounting our instance to, and we're going to add an attribute vcloak. And it looks like at some point here I lost the end of this div tag, so I'll go ahead and add that at the end. All right, then the other thing we're going to do in our CSS is we're going to style this attribute and we're going to set it to display none. So it's going to hide all of our content. And then when the Vue instance mounts, it's going to automatically remove this attribute, and that will effectively then remove the styling that's hiding it, and it will show the content. All right, let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to set a attribute for the vcloak, and the syntax for selecting an element by attribute is we just put the attribute in square brackets. So we'll say vcloak, and then for the style, we'll say display none. And let's go ahead and test that out. So I'm going to refresh the page, and that's what we're looking for. There still is a little bit of a flash that's happening, but it's just basically the div isn't there, the JavaScript loads, then it is there. Which is better than what we were seeing before, which was like the inner guts of our template. We were just seeing that immediately. So I think that's a good stopping point for this video. To conclude things, I do want to jump back to the notes and just highlight that at the end I have a summary of the key things we've talked about in this video. And remember, the point of this video is really to give you a broad sampling of some of the primary tools we're going to be using in Vue. Each of these things I talked about, from working with options within your Vue instance to other Vue directives, we're going to break into them in more detail in upcoming videos in the series. The other thing I want to mention is that right now, to begin with, we are working with a style of Vue that is referred to as the options API. This whole idea of creating an object with different options for things like data and methods. This is one style of programming with Vue. Another style that was introduced in Vue version 3 is something called the Composition API, which is a slightly different way of organizing your application. And that is something we will be talking about in this series. I will introduce the Composition API and talk about it versus the Options API, why you would choose one or the other. All right, now, if you're not familiar with either of those things, it's not something you need to worry about right now. It's more just something for those of you who are wondering. I did want to note that we'd be covering both of those approaches. All right, and then finally, you'll notice at the end of the notes, there's also a practice exercise to play around with some of the things we've talked about in this video. And the task here is to add a reset button that appears once the user has guessed the correct answer. And this button should reset the answer to a blank string and hide the feedback on the page. So basically, once we've entered our answer and we get feedback, play around with adding a reset button that would clear out the answer, clear out the feedback, basically bring us back to the blank slate of when we first load the page. So try your hand out at that, and in the next part of the series, part 3, I will start the video with a solution so you can compare and contrast it with what you came up with. In my experience, whenever I've sat down to learn a new technology, sometimes it could be useful to occasionally pause and look at how things are working behind the scenes or understand the underlying design principles that go into the technology, because Once we understand that, it can really enlighten how we're working with that technology and how we're understanding it. So with that in mind, let's take a moment here to just look at some of the underlying principles that guide the Vue.js framework in terms of how it works behind the scenes, starting with things like the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM is a popular technique you'll see in lots of JavaScript frameworks, and the idea is to optimize the efficiency in which we can update content on the page. Now, to understand what the virtual DOM is, let's rewind and talk just about the DOM in general, or the document object model. Every web page we view is based on the document object model, where we have these HTML elements that create a tree-like structure of our content. For example, I have a very basic HTML document here, and as we know in HTML, we work with these nested elements, right? So the outermost element is this HTML element, and then within inside of there, we have the head element and the body element. Then looking further within that, within the body element, we have an unordered list, and then that unordered list contains a list item. If we visualize this in a tree-like structure, we can break it down like this diagram, right? So the HTML is the outermost element, then the head and the body, and then again, the body is broken down further into this unordered list. So that's the basic idea of the document object model, this tree hierarchy type structure that is formed by our content. And then when we want to update it, when we want to change our interface, we can use JavaScript to do that. And I've got a basic example here of what this would look like in vanilla JavaScript, where you might come up with a new list item, and then using the DOM API, we can target things. So here we would target the UL with the class list, and then we could add our new list item to it. And for a simple example like this, that would be plenty efficient. But imagine multiplying this, thinking back to in part one of the series, we talked about web applications like Google Docs. In something like that, you might have hundreds or even thousands of elements within your page, and you might have programmed into that hundreds or thousands of DOM manipulations for that interface. At a certain point, you would start to notice some performance kind of costs or lagginess to the interface, because every time you're working with that DOM and manipulating it with JavaScript, there's a processing cost that comes with that. So one way to address this and to speed up our interfaces is to create a virtual DOM. And that's what Vue.js does. And like I said, a lot of other frameworks do this as well, where basically they create a JavaScript object with a mapping of your document structure. And then when you call to manipulate that structure with your Vue code, what it'll do is it'll first look through the object and kind of almost plan out how it's going to go about doing that, finding the most efficient way to do it, including if you're asking for multiple things to change, it can potentially batch together those changes. And then, of course, once it's done with this processing, it will actually manipulate the DOM itself, but it really tries to minimize the amount of manipulations it has to take, thereby making your application more performant. So the virtual DOM is kind of key thing number one to understand about how frameworks like Vue.js works. Moving on, the next thing that I want to emphasize is the reactivity system. This was something we actually saw an example of in the previous video, where we had things like our answer data property. And we saw that wherever we were using that, it was always going to be kept up to date. Right. So for example, we had a text input that was modeled after the answer data property, and then later we output it to the page. So anytime we change that value via this input, we automatically and instantly saw those changes reflected here where we output it. Another example where we saw reactivity, things like our show feedback div down here. On initial page load, show feedback is false, so we didn't see this div. But then via our check answer method, once we click this, that updated our feedback data property to true, and then automatically our interface was updated to reflect that. This div then appeared on the page because it was reactively listening for changes to that data property. So those were good examples of the reactivity system in action. And if you want to know more about how this is working behind the scenes, I do have that information in the notes. I've summarized it and also linked over to a page in the Vue documentation that breaks it down into more details. But for our purposes, we don't have to concern ourselves too much with how it's working. We just have to understand that it is working and understand how that's going to impact the code that we're writing. And this actually brings me to the last point I want to make in this video about how frameworks like Vue really change the paradigm about how we're programming our interfaces from an imperative style to a more declarative style of programming. And if you're not familiar with these terms, let me break it down. When we talk about imperative programming, we're talking about being very specific in what we want to happen. And I share here this metaphor of, let's say you were asking someone to get some eggs. The imperative way you could do this would be to be very specific about each step that would be required to do that. Now, contrast that to declarative instructions or declarative programming, where you're going to be much more broad, much more general. You're going to focus on just the end result, which is simply bring home eggs. You're not going to spend time breaking down the individual steps necessary to make that happen. Now, prior to JavaScript frameworks like Vue.js, typically the way we programmed our interfaces was in a very imperative style. And I have an example of that down here, where we can imagine a game interface where the first thing we do is we ask the visitor to type in their player name, and then we output that to the page. Kind of similar to our previous example where we ask the user for their answer and then we immediately output it. Same thing here. If we were doing this without Vue, we would write this in a very imperative style where we would first have to explicitly target elements on the page using that document object model API. And then we would have to explicitly say, okay, for our name and input, let's attach an event listener to it so that anytime it changes, we could update our name output here, reflecting the new value. Right? This is very explicit and detailed in terms of targeting the elements on the page, listening for changes, and deciding what should happen when those changes occur. Now compare this to a more declarative, a more general style of programming where we set up our input and we set up our output, and we're not doing anything in terms of setting up event listeners or explicitly saying, okay, when player name changes here, we need to update it here. All of that is really abstracted by Vue.js. Because of the reactivity system, we have this value player name, and it's just going to be listening for changes to that so that when it changes in the input, we'll see those changes reflected here where we're outputting it. The end result is it really simplifies our job as programmers because we don't have to worry as much about the how or the specific details of what we want to happen. We can really just focus on the interface, the data properties within that interface, and wire everything up so that behind the scenes, Vue is going to take care of the interactivity for us. So now that we understand the difference between these two programming styles, let's talk about why. Like, why does this matter? Why should we be thinking about this in this stage of our learning about Vue.js? And the reason is because I find that often JavaScript developers that are new to JavaScript frameworks, you really have to switch your mindset to the declarative programming style. Because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in situations where you're going to try to write code like this, right? You're going to try to be very specific about what you want to happen in the interface. You're going to try to add event listeners and things like that. You're going to try to directly manipulate the DOM. And those are all things you don't need to do when working with Vue and things you shouldn't be doing because as we saw, or as I was talking about earlier, Vue uses the virtual DOM. So it's going to do those manipulations for you. It's going to do it in the most efficient way. So it's not something that you should be directly working with. Instead, you really want to shift your focus to the data of your application and think about how that needs to be manipulated and let Vue handle the details of reflecting those manipulations in your interface. And with that, that's all I want to say right now about big picture behind the scenes, what Vue is doing. We've talked about the virtual DOM, course, your activity system, and then how this all ties into this shift to a more declarative programming style. And I want you to think about these in the coming videos and the coming examples as we're designing our interfaces and our applications. Think about how these things are playing into that. Before we wrap things up, though, I do want to go over the solution to the practice exercise I left you with at the end of the previous video. So let's switch back to our code editor. And the task was to add a reset button to our interface. And this is actually a good opportunity to start to think in that declarative style programming where instead of worrying about the mechanics of the button to begin with, let's focus on, well, what needs to happen to the data in order to reset our interface? And the things that I can think need to happen are things like our answer data property needs to be set back to its initial state, which was just an empty string. Similarly, the other data property that gets changed is show feedback. That gets toggled to true when we check our answer. So to reset things, we would want to set it back to false. All right, so to address that, let's actually create another method. We could just call it reset, and we'll make those changes. So we're going to say this.answer, and we're going to set it to an empty string. And then for show feedback, we'll set this back to false. Then coming back to our template, we'll add a button to trigger that method. So I'll just copy our existing check answer button, and we'll change our click expression here to reset, and then we'll change the label of the button to reset. And in thinking about the placement of this, the way we've written it is we're always going to see the reset button, which that's not necessarily something we need when we first come to the page. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm just going to move this inside of our show feedback div. So we'll only see the option to reset once we've actually checked our answer. All right, so let's go check this out in the browser. Let's refresh it. All right, great. So here's our starting point. We don't see the reset button, but we go ahead and enter our answer. We click check answer, and then we've got our feedback and then our reset button. So let's try it out. And perfect, we're back to our starting point. So far in our FlashWord example, we have a broad overview of some of the key features we're going to be working with in Vue. And so now what I want to do is I want to start to zoom in and look in more detail at these features. And specifically in this video, I want to talk about conditional rendering, which involves the use of directives like vif, velse, and also velsif to conditionally render elements on the page based on some Boolean JavaScript expression. And we've seen a few examples of this so far in our FlashWord demo, things like only displaying the answer once we actually have a value for that. So we set that up, we have this paragraph element, we're saying if the answer is not blank, right? If that evaluates true, we're going to see this on the page. And of course, because our data in Vue is reactive, when we make our Boolean expressions involve things like our data properties, we will see this reevaluated as we use our interface. If we change answer, that is going to potentially change whether or not we're seeing this paragraph based on its value. So in general, using the vif and else if directives, pretty straightforward, but there's a couple technical things to understand. The first is if you're using a velse or a velsif, it has to immediately follow some element that has a vif. For example, let's say I had injected another paragraph here. This would create an error. In fact, let's go ahead and run this just to show that error. So I'll refresh our application and I'll pull up my web inspector. And we'll go over to the console tab, and here's our warning coming from Vue. And it's pretty clear what's going on here. It tells us exactly what the problem is, where we're using a velse or velsif with no adjacent vif or velsif, and then it actually points to the specific line where the problem is. And seeing this is actually just a good reminder in general to always have that console open. So if you're getting feedback from Vue, errors, warnings, that sort of thing, you can find out more information about it and address the problem. All right, so quick fix on our end, we'll just get rid of that paragraph and that should bring it back to working order. Another point to understand about conditional rendering is, as we've seen in things like our show feedback div, oftentimes we're grouping together content that we're showing and hiding. And in this case, I just use a generic div for that. But another element that you might want to employ is the template element, because this element is actually designed for exactly the kind of thing we're doing here, where this content is not necessarily something we're going to see on initial page load. It's something that will be dynamically shown by JavaScript after the page has loaded. And in fact, let's jump back to the notes for this video, because I've got a definition of the template element pulling from the Mozilla Developer Network. We're told that it's an element for holding HTML that is not to be rendered immediately when a page is loaded, but may be instantiated subsequently during runtime using JavaScript. Right, so it's designed for this sort of thing. And if you're a stickler for HTML semantics, which we should be, then it is perhaps a more appropriate element of choice versus a generic div. But at the end of the day, either would work. Moving on, while we're here in the notes, the other directive that is related to conditional rendering is the vshow directive. Like our conditional directives, it'll also allow you to toggle content on the page. It's just how it's doing it is a little bit different. And to show you what I mean, let's actually pull this example from the notes into our FlashWord demo so we can run it. And in the example, I just hard-coded our Boolean expression as false, but let's make this a little bit more interesting. Let's make it dependent on our answer data property. So I'm going to say if answer is not a empty string, then we should see both of these paragraphs. All right, let's go ahead and load this. All right, so an initial page load, answer is blank, so we don't see either of them. But as we start typing the answer, we see both of them. And then if we make the answer blank again, they disappear. All right, now what I want to look at is what is actually happening behind the scenes in our document object model to make these paragraphs show and hide. And to examine this, I'm going to switch over to my Elements tab in my Web Inspector. And looking within my Div ID app, if we look at the bottom where I had these paragraphs, you'll notice that the second paragraph that we had the vShow on, it is part of our document object model, but the reason we're not seeing it on the page is because it's got this style of display none applied to it. All right, now compare that. Let's enter and answer again to bring back both of those. Now, example B, which again is the one that we have the vShow on, it removed that style so we see it on the page. Whereas the previous paragraph, the way we're seeing that is it actually injected it into the DOM. Whereas if we get rid of it again, we make that false, it removed it from the DOM. All right, so when we use the v-if conditional, the way it's showing and hiding the content is actually adding and removing it from the DOM. Whereas with vShow, it's making that toggle happen via CSS properties. Now, the end result on the page and to the viewer is the same. It's just the behind the scenes way it's doing it is different. And that, of course, raises the question, well, why would you use one over the other? And it comes down to this. It comes down to how often you plan to toggle that content on and off. For example, imagine our example B paragraph here was like a notification widget that we wanted to frequently show and hide as the user is interacting with the interface. In that case, we would want to use vShow because the process of showing and hiding that by just changing the CSS property is going to be more efficient than having to manipulate the DOM to show and hide it. Especially if we think about, Vue is like a big system of dependencies. So if we had other elements inside of this paragraph that was relying on things like our data properties or had its own event listeners, like all of those things would also have to be updated in Vue's memory as we toggle that content on and off. So again, from a performance standpoint, just, showing and hiding it via CSS is going to be more efficient. On the flip side, we also want to think about the performance of the initial page load, right? We want to get our interface to the user as quickly as possible. So if we have some elements that we don't need on initial page load, it would be best if we could avoid having to load them into the DOM. And that's where the v-if comes in because it's not going to add to the DOM until we actually need it. So we could potentially speed up our initial page load. But again, if we're talking about elements that we do anticipate rapidly turning on and off, then it is worth that initial loading cost to just get it in the DOM and then toggle it via CSS as needed. Now, all of these performance things we're talking about with v-if versus vShow, these are not things that you're going to notice a tangible difference in this basic example, but everything we're doing, we really want to think about how this will scale up. Thinking about more complex interfaces at the scope of something like Google Docs, where you might be dealing with hundreds of elements that are potentially either being rendered on initial page load or not. And that's where you will start to notice the kind of performance gains and losses. All right, so we just want to make sure we're developing good habits early on in terms of the tools that we're using and understanding where one tool is more appropriate than the other. And with that concludes what I wanted to say about conditional rendering. It's a pretty straightforward concept within Vue, but definitely important, something you're going to be using frequently throughout your interfaces. The next topic we want to tackle in this series is list rendering. List rendering is the process of iterating through data properties, things like arrays and objects within your application and displaying them on the page. And the way we can accomplish this is using Vue's v-for directive, which works very similarly to JavaScript's for-in statement. So the syntax for it and how we use it is going to be pretty familiar. To walk through some examples of its use, I've got some data set up that we can work with. I've come up with an array of data, an object of data, and also an array of objects that is in the theme of our FlashWord application in terms of words and translations of words. It's not something that we're going to be specifically using for this application. This is really just for practice purposes. So if you're following along and you want to get your FlashWord example set up like I have it, go ahead and copy these data properties as I have in the notes, and you'll want to bring them into your FlashWord application as currently written. And within your data option, you just want to add this at the end in addition to the existing data properties that we've set up. And for our first example, I want to focus in on this array of data, which I've just got a handful of Spanish words within here. And what we want to do is use the v-for directive to iterate through this array and output these words to the page. So coming back to our template, I'm going to add this just at the very end. Doesn't really matter where we're putting it. Like I said, it's for practice. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up a unordered list element. And then what I want to do is for each of those words, I want to display a list item with the word. So within this list item, I'm going to add the v-for directive. And I'm going to first come up with an alias that is going to represent the current element we're looking at as we iterate through this array. And the name of our array that we're working with is Spanish words plural. So for the alias, I'm just going to say Spanish word singular. That's going to represent each word as we go through. And then I'm going to use the in keyword and then specify the name of the array we're iterating through, which, like I just said, is Spanish words. All right, then within the list item itself, I will use our text interpolation technique to output each word, which will be represented by this alias. And that should do it. So let's refresh this in the browser. And perfect, there's our list of words. Now expanding on this, if for whatever reason we also needed access to the index position of the array as we're iterating through, we can get that by expanding on our for structure here, where after the alias for the value, we'll come up with an alias for the index. For example, let's call it just index. All right, so now just to show that we have access to this, I'm just going to output it before the word, like so. All right, and there we go. We've got our indexes of the array. So that's a basic example of iterating through an array using the v-for directive. And at this point, I just want to note that I am demonstrating this using list items because that seems like a logical thing for list rendering, but it doesn't have to be a list item. We could do this with any HTML element. For example, I can get rid of the unordered list altogether and just convert this to, say, a paragraph element. All right, we should still see that repeated on the page, but we just have separate paragraphs now. Moving on from arrays, let's talk about iterating through objects. So for this example, we're going to use the word object that I set us up with. You can see this has two keys A and B, where key A is some Spanish word and key B is the English translation. So let's look at how we can iterate through the data within this object. So after our previous example, we'll set up another unordered list with a list item that will attach our v-for directive to. And to begin with, let's just access the values within this object, which is just going to be our two different words. So I'm going to come up with another alias. My instincts say just use the alias word, right? Because that's what our values are. But I don't want to conflict with the fact that the object itself is called word. So just to distinguish from that, I'm going to prefix it with this word. The idea being as we're iterating through this object, this word is going to represent the current word that we're looking at. So we'll say this word in word. And then again, using text interpolation, we'll just output this word. And just to distinguish these examples, let's just throw a heading before each of them. So this was our array example, and this is our object example. All right, so let's preview that. All right, perfect. So we got access to both of those words within our word object. And expanding on this, if we wanted to also access things like the key of this object, which in this case would be A and B, we can get that by adding it after our value alias. We'll just come up with an alias for the key, which I'll just call key. And then we'll output that before the word itself. And I'll just separate it with a colon. And there we go. All right, and then just like our array, if we want to know the index position as we're iterating through, we can also access that. We'll just tack that on as another alias. And again, I'll just call it index. And I will output that before our key. All right, so there's our index, our key, and our value. And then finally, combining these techniques together, we can also work with arrays of objects. And the example I have for that is this array of objects I'm calling words. So the contents of this is an array where we have individual objects. And within each object, we have a word A and a word B, where word A is the word we would hypothetically present to the user, and word B would be the expected answer. And of these examples we've worked with so far, I think this is most representative of the actual kind of data structure we will be looking at when we work with FlashWord. So let's make sure we can work through this. Coming back to our template, we'll set up another example. And just like we did with our basic array example, we just want to come up with some alias that's going to represent each value within the array, which in this case is an object. So let's just call it word object. And we're iterating through words. And to start with, let's just output that to the page. So there we go. We can see the full contents of that object. And at that point, because we're just working with an object, if we wanted to get to the individual parts of the object, we could just use our standard JavaScript object notation. So I could do things like word object dot word A, and that would just give me the word A value within that object. All right, and I can access both word A and B if I wanted to. So I could start to put this together, something like the English translation of, and that would output our Spanish word, and then we could output as well our English word. And then finally, because what we're really dealing with here is just an array, just like we did with our initial array example, if we needed things like the index position, we could include that as part of our structure as well. So we would just say word object comma index, and then we could prefix each of these outputting that index. Looking beyond arrays and objects, we can also use the v-for directive to do like a numerical iteration. So for example, let's do this. We'll set up another unordered list. And the alias we'll use, we'll just call it number. And what we're going to iterate through in this case is just going to be some numerical value. So let's say 10. So that's basically the equivalent of just like a regular for loop in JavaScript, where if you needed to do something X amount of times, you could structure it around a number. All right, and then finally, we could also do this for strings. If we had a string and we wanted to iterate through each character in this string, we could set it up in the same fashion. This time I'll change my alias to character, and then I'll give it some string that we want to iterate through. And I'll just say, I don't know, hello world. And we should see each character in this string. Now, I can't really think of why we would use either of these last two examples in our FlashWord application, but in the interest of just seeing the things that we could iterate through and putting this v-for directive to use, I did want to include them. And to wrap up this discussion, there's one last thing I want to talk about with list rendering. And that is when we find ourselves wanting to combine the v-for directive with the v-if directive. As an example of this, let's rewind to our array example. And let's just say, hypothetically, we only wanted to display words within our array that were greater than 3 characters long. For example, let's say we incorporated like a difficulty level within the application where you could say only show me, moderate or hard words. So we will exclude any words 3 characters or less. How we might instinctually do this is within our for loop where we're going through our words, we could tack on a v-if directive, and we could say that we only want to render this element if the word that we're currently looking at is greater than 3 characters. So for example, we would say Spanish word, and in JavaScript, the way we can get the length of a word is just using the length method, and we want to see if it's greater than 3. This seems like a really logical approach to this, but what we'll find is when we run this, it's not actually going to work. And not only will it not work, it actually creates an error in our application. You can see it's preventing it from loading. And to see the error, let's bring back our web inspector, go to the console, and we're getting an error telling us it cannot read properties of undefined, and it's trying to get the length. So this is referring to right here where it's trying to get the length of Spanish word. It's telling us it's undefined. And the reason for this is when you combine a v-for and a v-if directive, the v-if directive takes precedence. In other words, this is going to be executed first. And so if this is executed before the v-for, well, this alias Spanish word that we created, it just doesn't exist yet. So that's why this is going to fail. So what we would want to do in this situation is rather than trying to combine these 2 directives in the same element, we want to separate them out. And I'll show this. So I'll take this v-if and I'll move it to another element that I'll wrap around our content. And in this case, I'm going to take advantage of that template element we were talking about in a previous video because I need something to attach this v-if to, and I don't want to just introduce another element here because I don't want to have like a paragraph and a paragraph, or if I was still dealing with list items, I wouldn't want to have 2 list items embedded. Basically, I just need some element I could wrap around the inner content that I could decide to conditionally render. All right, now this is going to work because now that these two things are separate, what will happen is as it's going through the page and rendering it, it's going to process this v4. It's going to make Spanish word defined so that inside of here, we'll be able to execute our if statement and determine whether or not we should show the current word as we're iterating through. Let's make sure this is working as expected. And much better, we're not getting an error, and you can see our updated array example where we're only seeing the words that are greater than 3 characters long. I think the other words we had in this array were uno and dos, so you could see that those are being excluded. All right, so long story short, when you find yourself in a situation where you want to combine a v4 and a v-if, you can do it, just don't do it on the same element, separate it out into 2 separate elements. Alternatively, later in the series, we'll be talking about something called computed properties, which is another way that you could handle trying to accomplish something like this. So just kind of put a pin in that in the back of your head. Computed properties, if you're in this situation, that might actually be a better solution. We'll take a look at that later. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at event handling in Vue, focusing specifically on the v-on directive, which we've already seen an example in our FlashWord demo so far. So let's take a moment to review that. All right, where we saw this used was within our check answer button. We have the v-on directive here. And with this, we learned that some directives take arguments, which is just some value you're going to put after the directive following a colon. In the case of v-on, the arguments we can give it are any DOM event, such as click, change, if we want to listen for some change to an element. Let's say we had like a dropdown and we wanted to do something when that dropdown was changed, we could do that. We can also listen for mouse events, things like mouse over, mouse out. And also we can listen for keyboard events, which we'll see an example of in a moment. As for the value that we specify for the v-on directive, it's going to be just some JavaScript expression that we want to execute. And the way we last left this example is we were using a method handler. So the expression we wanted to execute was just executing a method that we had defined within our Vue instance options. And this made sense because there were 2 things we needed to do in response to this click. So offloading that over to methods over here just gave us more room to work with this code. But as we saw before we got to the method, we could also handle this via an inline handler where we directly wrote the expression in our template. And what that looked like is we had something like this. We set our correct data property to be the result of comparing word B and whatever the answer was. And then we expanded on that. We also needed to change our show feedback data property. We needed to set that to true when this button was clicked. All right, so that's an example of an inline handler. You just throw the JavaScript directly within your template. Now, in seeing these 2 different approaches, we also talked about how when you're referencing your data properties as part of these expressions, if you're working inline in the template here, you could just directly reference those data properties. Whereas if you're working within a method, you needed to prefix each of those data properties with the special keyword this. All right, and the reason we talked about that or why this is because within this context, when we're working within methods, if we don't specify this, it's going to see these properties as just local variables. We have to explicitly indicate that we're talking about properties of this instance. That's where the this keyword comes into play. Whereas our template, not necessary. We don't have to prefix them with this just because of how the template is processed by Vue. Basically makes all of our data properties accessible directly. And with that, that recaps everything we know about the v-on directive so far. So let's dig into some additional details to know about event handling. And for the next detail, let me actually revert this back. I do want to invoke our check answer method again. And what I want to show is how we can access meta information about the event that's being triggered. The way we will do this is we will pass a special parameter to our methods called event, and we're just going to prefix that with a $sign. And then within the method itself, we will set up a parameter to receive that information. And just to show what this is going to get us, I'm just going to log to the console what event is. So let me pull this up in the browser. It doesn't really matter what I enter at this point, but I'm going to click the button. That's going to be our event. And here's what we're looking at down in the console. Let me zoom in on this. This is the meta information about the event itself. So in this case, we're dealing with a click. So in the world of the browser API, this is referred to as a pointer event. And you can see we have all this information about it, including things like what was the XY coordinate of the mouse when we actually click the button. Lots of other details within here. Now, this sort of information for this example of clicking a button, we don't really need this, but you can imagine how this might be useful in other situations. Let's say we were building like a really interactive game where, we were trying to click on some target on the page and we wanted to give the user feedback as to whether they were hitting that target. Being able to access things like the XY coordinates of the mouse could be useful for that. Now, obviously not applicable to our FlashWord demo, but useful to just tuck away in the back of our head if we ever needed that meta information. Moving on, another event handling technique I want to take a look at is the use of modifiers. And the way I want to demonstrate modifiers is I want to rewind back to our text input here, and I want to make it so that after we enter an answer, if the user hits the enter key, we want that to also trigger our check answer method. To set this up, we'll use the Vue directive again. And then this time, the event we're going to listen for, instead of click, we're going to listen for the key up event. And then here's where modifiers come in. Following that, we're going to say period, some modifier. And in this case, our modifier is going to be what key we actually want to listen for. So in this case, it's going to be enter. And then we'll just specify what we want to happen, which again, I just wanted to also trigger our check answer method. And let's clean that method up. We don't actually need the event anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. All right, and let's test this out. So we should be able to check our answer either via hitting enter or clicking the button. So I'll enter an answer, hit enter, and perfect. And that's the most typical modifier you're going to use when working with an event listener like key up. But you can listen for other keyboard keys as well, things like the shift key, your control key, etc. And as a point of reference for this, let me go back to the notes. And I'm going to go down to this section we're talking about now, modifiers. I do have a link here over to the Mozilla Developer Network where they talk about all the possible keyboard events that we could be listening for. And the thing to understand about those events when we're using them in this Vue context as these modifiers is we just need to make a case convention switch. So in the official docs, you'll see this upper camel case styling being used. And when we're using those events as modifiers within our Vue context, we just need to switch to this lower kebab case styling. And just as an example of this, let's just go over to the docs and find a key event we want to work with. For example, I'm just going to search for our arrow key events. All right, so let's say we wanted to do something in response to the user pressing the down arrow. We're told here that it's arrow down. So coming back to our code, the way we would use this is instead of writing arrow down, we would just convert it to all lowercase and we would separate the two words with a dash. Now, I don't know why we would actually want to do that in this context, but I did just want to show that. But I'm going to revert this back to the enter key. So those are the details on listening for specific keys via a modifier. And I should mention, we will see other examples of modifiers when working with Vue. So just to break down the anatomy of how we're working with these directives, we have the directive itself. Potentially, we sometimes have an argument, not always, right? With the vModel, we didn't have an argument. And then in addition to the argument itself, we may further customize how this is working by adding a modifier. And finally, somewhat related to this whole idea of the architecture of our directives, some of our directives also have shortcuts. Specifically for our directives that we use frequently, things like event listeners, we can abbreviate this with a @ sign. And we can do this for any of our Vue directives. And it's just a syntax shortcut, just because directives like Vue, you will find yourself using them a lot throughout your templates. In this series and in my code, I tend to stick with the full Vue directive just because it's less cognitive overload as you're looking through your code. I like it to be a little bit more expressive, a little bit more explicit. But by all means, go with whatever style you prefer. My main recommendation would be just be consistent, right? So if you're going to use the shortcut, always use it. Don't switch back and forth between using it and not using it. It's just going to make your code harder to think through as you're reading through it. To wrap up this discussion of event handling, I want to talk about something that stood out to me when I was first learning Vue. And it goes back to how we're invoking JavaScript, whether it be expressions or methods, in line with our HTML templates. At first, this seemed really counterintuitive to me because the way that I was taught JavaScript is it was very important to have separation of concerns between your HTML and your JavaScript. And as an example of this, let me actually go back to the notes. I talk about this at the very end, this idea of a shift in convention. And here I have an example of a button with a regular on-click attribute. This is just like not Vue specific. It is just part of what we have access in the browser API. And we can use it to invoke JavaScript. But like I said, when I was learning JavaScript, I was taught that this was bad. Instead, what we would do is in our, say, external JavaScript file, we would access the button via the DOM and attach an event listener to it. And then we could specify what we wanted to happen. Right. And the idea with this was separation of concerns, so that we weren't mixing JavaScript with our HTML. So if you also came to learn JavaScript under this school of approach, just seeing the use of the v-on directive in Vue might seem wrong. But the reason we're seeing a shift kind of back towards this inline style is, remember, we talked about how with Vue frameworks, we're moving towards a more declarative style of programming. And with that, we are avoiding having to interact directly with the DOM from our JavaScript. Right? So statements like this, where we target something in the DOM and do something to it, is not something we should be doing in a Vue framework. All right, so we don't have this option. And then, our best alternative then is to directly specify what JavaScript should be executed from the element itself. And I still think it's okay in terms of separation of concerns, especially if you are taking advantage of methods, right? Because the core of the JavaScript, when you're using methods, is actually happening in your JavaScript file in that method. I think if you're trying to do everything via inline handlers and expressions, then yeah, that's going to get a little messy in terms of mixing your HTML and JavaScript, but it doesn't have to be that way because we do have access to methods. And then the other nice thing about this is, if you think about it, is when you're looking through your HTML template, you really have a much more complete picture of what's going on, because the way we did things previously, you could have click listeners attached to buttons, but you had no way of knowing that when you were actually looking at your HTML template and your HTML code. Whereas in the world of Vue, using the v-on directive is just much clearer, scanning through our templates to understand what is happening with these elements and what is the connection with the data and also the actions of our application. So it is a shift in convention, but I think it's one of those that once you get used to it, you come to appreciate it. And we'll see this a couple more times, this sort of going against the grain when it comes to working with frameworks. And we'll talk about that when that comes up, and talk about the pros and cons and merits of different approaches to things. All right, but that's all I have to say in this video about event handling with the v-on directive. In the next part of the series, we're going to take a look at attribute binding. The next tool we want to look at within Vue is attribute binding. And just as a little refresher of our HTML knowledge, attributes are just extra configuration information we give to HTML elements. For example, for the HTML element image, we typically include a source attribute where we can specify the path to the image that we want to load. We'll also include things like a alt attribute to indicate an alternate text description of that image. And I've got a couple other examples here of other attributes we commonly use within our HTML elements. Now, where attribute binding comes in with Vue is it allows us to dynamically set values for these attributes. And the way that we do that is using the Vue directive vbind. As an example of this, I want to work an image into our FlashWord example so far. And I went ahead and put an image on a server that we could use for this. Let me go ahead and load this path so you can see what we're going to be working with. All right, so we just got a little green check mark that we can display when they get the answer correct. And then there's also a version of this for incorrect, which displays a red X. And what I'd like to do is dynamically choose one of those images to display as part of our feedback. So if they get the answer correct, not only should we see our feedback message, we should also see that green check mark and then the red X if they get it incorrect. So to set this up, let's go over to our code. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a new data property that will be set to the appropriate image path depending on whether or not they got it correct. So let's just create a data property. We'll call it image. I'll go ahead and initialize it as null. When we first load the page, we don't know if it's correct or incorrect. But then down here in our check answer, this is where we're going to set that value. So what I'll do is after we know if correct is true or false, we're going to use that to influence what image we want to set. So we'll say if this correct, in other words, if correct is true, then we want this image to be the path to our correct image. This will be the green check mark. Otherwise, we'll use an else here. This image will be set to the incorrect image path. So now that we've got that data property set up, let's go over to our template. And down here in our feedback element, we're going to put an image on the page. And the way that we're going to set the source for this image is we're going to use the vbind directive. And we're going to indicate what we want to be binding here, which is going to be the source. And then we're going to set it to our image data property. So now that source will be dynamic depending on whatever image is set to within our JavaScript. Let's test this out. We'll start with a correct answer. All right, perfect. There's our green check mark. And let's do a incorrect answer. And it swaps out to that red X. So that works. But another way that we can handle this is if we look at the image path, for both of the images, it's basically the same path, right? It's coming from the same server. It has the same extension. The only thing that is different is part of the image name. It's either correct or incorrect. So rather than repeating this full path, what if we just made that part dynamic? Let me show you what I mean. So instead of setting it to be the full path, we're going to set image to be, in this case, for the correct image, we'll just say correct. And then down here, we'll set it to incorrect. And then the path for the image, we're not going to include this in our JavaScript anymore. Instead, what we'll do over in our template is we're going to set our source to be a string that has the full URL and the full extension. But then just for this part of the image name, we're going to make this dynamic. So I'll get rid of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to concatenate in our image data property. So I'm going to stop the string with a quote, right? Because the string itself starts here with this double quote. So I'm going to stop it. Then I'll use our JavaScript concatenation character, the plus sign. Then I'll reference my image data property. And then to go back into the string, I'll use the plus sign again, and then begin the string again with a double quote. Let me go ahead and zoom out just a little bit here so we could see that all on one full line. So we've got string plus our data property plus the end of our string. We put it all together, we should get a full image path. Let's give it a shot. Good, there's our green arrow, and there's our red X. So that's the basics of working with that vbind directive. Just a couple other little follow-up things to know about it. The first is there is a syntax shortcut for it. So just like for von, we could shorten that to just an @ sign. With vbind, you can shorten it to just a colon. Not something I'll do in my examples just because I do like to be a little bit more explicit, but that option does exist if you like those shortcuts. Another note as it relates to vbind is sometimes rather than using vbind, what people will try to do when setting attribute values is they'll try to use text interpolation, right? Because we know that text interpolation in Vue, it's just going to inject some value into our HTML. So why couldn't we do something similar like that with our attributes? For example, let's say we wanted to set an alt on this image. I'm going to add an alt attribute, and let's come up with a data property. We'll call it image alt. And we will try to use text interpolation to just inject that as our alt value. All right, and of course we need to actually set this up. So I'll go back to my JavaScript. And I'll set some values for this. All right, so we've got that data property. This seems logical, right? Why can't we just text interpolate it to our alt attribute? Well, it's not going to work. But let me go ahead and show that. So we'll refresh our example. All right, and it's hard to see on the page because the alt is not something that is visible on the page. But if we look in our web inspector, we could see what's actually happening here. And you could see the alt, it's never actually rendered. We're still seeing that text interpolation there. All right, so that's not going to work. Text interpolation will not work to just like output values for an attribute. We have to use vbind here. And I'll go ahead and correct this. So we'll do vbind alt, and we'll set it to be that image alt data property. Refresh our example. Look at the document, and there you can see the alt was actually rendered as expected. So long story short, text interpolation and HTML attributes, they don't mix. The tool you want to be using there is vbind. Moving on, I want to talk about some interesting things you can do with vbind when it comes to CSS related styling, specifically when you're working with the class or the style attribute. And for the first example of this, let me go back to the notes. We're down here under the section of class and style binding. The first set of techniques I want to talk about is class binding with objects. What this allows you to do is to dynamically bind a class to an element using this object syntax. And the way that this is going to work is the property you're going to set in your object is going to be some class that you want to potentially apply And then the value will be some Boolean expression that if it evaluates to true, that class will get applied. Whereas if it evaluates to false, the class won't get applied. To see this in action, let's work it into our FlashWord demo. And what we can do, let's start to add some like form validation. All right, so let's say they don't enter an answer and they submit the form. Let's give them some feedback, letting them know there was a problem. And just to set this up, let's introduce some data properties for this. So let's say we have a data property called has error that's going to indicate whether or not the form has an error. And to begin with, we'll set it to false. We can assume when we first load the page, there aren't any errors. But then down here, when we're checking the answer, the first thing we're going to do is make sure we actually have an answer. So if the answer is a blank string, at that point, we will toggle our has error data property to true. And then what we could do at that point too is we can return or exit this method, right? Because if there is an error, we don't want to execute the rest of this code. All right, so now that we have that data property, coming back to our template, starting off with just like some basic text output on the page, we'll let them know if it has an error. So we'll integrate a paragraph that we will conditionally display. So we'll say if has error, and it says you must enter a answer. And the other thing I want to do for the input itself, I want to dynamically add a class to this input that is going to style it and draw attention to the input just to emphasize and support the feedback that we're giving them. So in anticipation of that, let's go ahead and set up a class for this. I'm just going to call it error. And what we'll do is we'll set it to be a background color of light pink. And then to dynamically apply that class to this input, we're going to use vbind. We're going to set a class, and here's where we're going to use our object syntax. So the key will be the class we want to potentially apply, which is going to be error. And then our true false value as to whether that will be applied is going to be that has error data property we had created. All right, so if has error is true, this error class will be applied. If it's false, it won't be applied. And let's go ahead and test that out. So I'm going to submit my form without entering an answer. And perfect. It draws attention to our input. We see that error class was applied. And of course, if we pull this up in our web inspector, we should be able to see that behind the scenes. So there's that class error. The other thing we should expect is that once we enter an answer and submit it again, that error should go away. But we haven't actually done anything in our JavaScript yet to toggle that has error data property back to false. So just coming back here and check answer, what we're going to do is after this if statement, I will set this has error to false because we can assume that if we didn't have an error, we didn't return out of this method. So we should get to this point. It should toggle has error to false and continue on with the rest of our method. All right, so now we can submit it with an error. We get our feedback. We see our styling as expected. But now if we enter an answer and submit it again, that's cleared out. And you can see down here, the class was actually removed. We don't have any classes being applied to this input. So that's one neat little trick you can do with vbind and class binding. This object syntax, it's almost like a little mini if statement in here, right? Because we're saying if some true false value, then apply this class. And this is one of those tools you're going to find yourself reaching for a lot when building applications, because a lot of interface development is just about manipulating CSS. So being able to apply and remove classes on the fly like this is really useful. And knowing that, let's go back to the notes because there's some additional things we could do with this that will be helpful to know about. One being that you can expand on your object. So let's say there's multiple classes you want to potentially apply. You could just add them as additional elements to your object, right? So in this case, the class error and critical could potentially be applied here, depending on whether our has error and our hypothetical is critical data property is true or false. You can also combine this with just a regular class attribute, right? So let's say your element always needs to have some class applied to it that isn't dependent on some data property. You could just set that like you would any other class and use that in combination with some dynamic class binding. Right, you could see how that could potentially be rendered. Basically, when Vue interprets this, it'll just smush it all down to just a regular class attribute. In addition to class binding with objects, you can also class bind with arrays. And this is used in situations where there's multiple classes that you would want to bind to an element. Let's say those classes are being set as like data property values. You could just combine them together with an array. And you can also see how this could actually be used in combination with that object syntax. So an element of your array could be one of those object expressions. And then finally, let's say you want to apply some styles, but you don't want to do it on a class basis. You want to do it like on an individual style property basis. You can also do binding with the style attribute. And let's go ahead and work up an example of this. So let's say we want to apply a background color to our input. We don't want to rely on the error class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this vbind to a style binding. And then for our object, the key is going to be the particular style property we want to apply, which in this case, it's going to be the background color. And then the value should be whatever color we want it to be, which we will make dependent on some data property. Let's call it input background color. All right, so let's make sure we set this up in our JavaScript. And what we'll do is we will initialize it to be white. And then down here, if we have an error, we will change it to light pink. And then similarly to how we had to toggle our has error back to false down here, if we made it past this check, we would want to toggle it back to white down here. All right, so now that should be able to dynamically set a background color. Before we run this though, one note about the style properties that we're using. When we're writing them in our Vue templates, we can't just write them with the hyphenated style that we usually use in CSS. We have to convert it to either camel case, or if we want to use the hyphen, we just have to surround that property in quotes like so. So let's go ahead and test this out, make sure it's working basically the same as it was before. We're just using a different technique to do that styling. So I'm going to submit my form without any answer. And there we go. We're still seeing that light pink. Let's look at how this is being handled behind the scenes. All right, there we go. So there's our dynamic style being applied inline. Our background color is set to light pink. Whereas if we enter an answer and we submit our form, it gets toggled back to white. So like I said, same outcome, just a different approach. And to be honest, for something like this with like background colors, I would go with the class-based styling. Where the inline styling like this could be useful is where you're dealing with a lot more variations in the styles. Let's say, I don't know, let's say the feedback is going to be a different font size on a scale of like 10 through 35 with every increment in between. You wouldn't have to want to create classes for each of those increments. In that case, it would make sense to just have like a dynamic property that was some numerical value that represented the font size, and you could inject that into the style. That would be a better use case for the style approach. But at the end of the day, a lot of these things can accomplish the same things. And that's one of the things you're going to notice the more and more we learn about Vue is there's going to be different ways of doing things that have pros and cons and will come down to personal preference. And you'll start to have to, pick which tool is the best for the job. But with that, this is where I'm going to conclude our discussion of attribute binding. We'll definitely get an opportunity to see some more examples of this as we continue to develop our FlashWord application. But now in the next part of this series, we're going to turn our attention to our forms and look at form input binding. Obviously, a big part of building interfaces is working with HTML forms. So in this video, we're going to focus on the tools that Vue.js provides for interacting with our form inputs. And to begin with, we can review what we know already. Rewinding and thinking back to part 2 of the series where we had like a sampling of different Vue.js features, one of the things we learned about was the vModel directive, which allowed us to bind a data property to a form input. And what we saw when we did that was when we changed the value of that input anywhere that we were using the associated data property, we would see those changes reflected too. All right, so when we start entering text into our answer input, here in this paragraph later where we're outputting the answer, we could see that dynamically and reactively changes accordingly. And similarly, of course, within our JavaScript as well, when we try to reference the answer data property within our code, we saw whatever was just typed into that text input. All right, so in terms of working with your basic text inputs and the vModel directive, it's really straightforward. You change the text input, that's going to change the data property. You change the data property, it would also change what we see in that input. Moving on though, let's talk about some other form input types and what vModel does with them, starting with things like checkboxes. When you're working with checkboxes, you want to model them after some data property that's going to return a Boolean value of true or false. And if that value is true, the associated checkbox will be checked. If it's false, it'll be unchecked. Let's pull this basic example into FlashWord. This is imagining, let's say down the road, we added a feature where we could toggle on and off a hint for the given word. We could use something like this. Not something we're actually going to implement now, but we could just pull this in for an example. All right, and I'll add this. We'll add it right after the text input itself. All right, now this is modeling after a data property of show hint. So I will initialize that for the purposes of this demo to be false. So coming back to our page, I'm going to refresh it. And because show hint is false to begin with, we should see that the checkbox is not checked off. But if we alter that, if I check it, that's going to toggle show hint to be true. And you can see that makes our hint with our placeholder here actually appear on the page, because coming back and looking at the example code for this, we could see that we have this div that's going to conditionally render based on whether show hint is true or false. All right, so again, just toggling this checkbox is going to toggle that show hint data property. And the inverse of that is true as well. If we were to change show hint, that would impact the checkbox. And I'll just show that manually here with my web inspector. Let's reference that show hint data property, and I'm just going to manually set it to false. And you should see that it unchecks the checkbox, or if we change it back to true, we see that reactively check it off again. Now, that's how it works when you're dealing with a single checkbox. You're dealing with this true-false scenario. But sometimes we see groups of checkboxes where we might have multiple options we want to choose from. And as an example of that, let's go back to the notes. I also have another hypothetical we can work with. Let's imagine we had categories of words that we could show in our application, such as greetings, colors, verbs. For each of these checkboxes, we could model it after the same data property. And for that data property, we would manage it via an array, which would include the values of those checkboxes. Let's see this in action. So I'm going to pull this into our working demo. And I'm just going to throw this at the end. This is not something we're actually integrating now. This is just for the example. All right, so we've got our 3 checkboxes there. We want to model it after this categories. So in our JavaScript, let's set up that data property. And to begin with, I'm just going to initialize it as an empty array. So when we load this, what we should see is those 3 checkboxes, but none of them should be checked. However, if we go back to our array, let's add some values here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick from the values I set on my checkboxes. So I've got the option of greetings, colors, or verbs. So let's start with just greetings. I'll add that to my array. So now when I refresh the page, you can see that greetings is checked off. And let's say I wanted them all checked off by default. I would just add all of those values to this array. The other thing we can observe is as we change these text inputs, it's going to dynamically update our categories data property. And to show this, let's go ahead and just first output what it is currently set to. So again, I'll reference within my data, let's look at our categories. Right, and as expected, we have greetings, verbs, and colors. So let's say I unchecked verbs and I'll output it again. You can see we were reduced down to 2 values, and we can continue down this path until eventually we have an empty data set again. Now, one thing you'll observe as I'm outputting the value for categories here, we're not seeing it as just a plain array. We're seeing it as this proxy object. And this is just something that Vue is doing behind the scenes. It allows it to make the data reactive by creating this special proxy object, which if you go back to, I think it was part 3 of this series, we were talking about behind the scenes, how Vue is working, how its reactivity system is set up. There was a mention there of proxies if you want to dig into that some more. It doesn't really impact any of the things that we're doing, but just I wanted to mention that based on this output here. Moving beyond checkboxes, let's also take a look at what we can do with radio inputs. So the example I have here is imagine we added the ability for the visitor to choose the difficulty level of the words that they were seeing. So we have 3 radio buttons, one for easy, moderate, and difficult. And each of these is modeled after this level data property, which you could see in this example. I'm defaulting it to easy. So what this would mean is when we first loaded this page, the first radio input that has the value of easy would be selected. Now notice the difference between radios and checkboxes. With checkboxes, we set our value via an array, and that makes sense because with checkboxes, you can have multiple checkboxes selected at the same time within one group, whereas with radio buttons, they're mutually exclusive. So within a group of radio buttons, you should only ever have one of them checked, so you should only have one value associated with it. So we set it to just be a single string versus an array of multiple strings. Let's see radios in action. So I'm going to pull this in to our code, and I'll just swap this out with my checkboxes. The other thing I'm going to pull in while we're talking about radio buttons is I also want to pull in a select example, just because it works very similar to radio buttons. So here we have a select. We're going to actually model it after the same data property level, just like we were doing with our radio buttons. And then we're going to have there are 3 options that have the appropriate value for easy, moderate, and difficult. All right, and then let's go ahead and set up that level data property that we're using here. We'll default it to easy. And this is blending together a little bit, so let me just throw a couple headings in there to distinguish these different inputs. All right, that's a little bit clearer. All right, so you can see for both of these, because the level is set to easy on initial page load, that's the option that we're seeing chosen. And then if I change it, let's say I switch it via my radio buttons, I update level to be difficult. You can see that's dynamically reflected in the dropdown. And then likewise in the dropdown, if I alter level, I change it to moderate, we'll see that reflected in the radio buttons. All right, now typically you wouldn't have 2 input types for the same information on the page, but this was just a good way to demonstrate how we can associate data properties with radios and dropdowns. And of course, because everything is reactive when it comes to our data properties, as we're changing that through one element, we can see those changes reflected. So we've got text inputs, we've got checkboxes, radio buttons, dropdowns. The last form element I want to take a look at is the text area. So let's work up an example for that. And for our hypothetical feature, we could use this for, let's say we were going to challenge the visitor to use the word in a sentence. So as part of their submission, they had to enter a sentence using the word that they're guessing. All right, so we'll throw a text area here. And then we're going to use that vModel directive again, and we'll model it after a data property we'll just call sentence. So over in our data properties, I will initialize that, and I will initialize it as an empty string. And the other thing I'll do just to see this reactive data is I'll just output the sentence to the page below the text area. All right, so refreshing our interface, here's our text area. And if I enter some text there, we can see it updates our description accordingly. So basically, it works the same as our text input we saw earlier with the answer, where you just model it after some data property that's set to a string. The one thing I will note about the text area is sometimes with text areas, our instinct in terms of like setting default content for a text area is we typically put the default content within the text area element itself. That's how we would do things in regular HTML. So seeing that, your instincts might say, well, let's just text interpolate the sentence data property as that content, right? Thinking that you could do something like that. And that would work in terms of setting the initial content, right? So let's say we had set this to, instead of an empty string, we had some content here. When we first loaded the page, we would see that it would fill that text area with that content, but it wouldn't be a two-way data binding, right? If we change that, you could see it's not actually updating that sentence. Right, so if you do want that two-way binding, you do have to use that vModel directive to not only set the initial value, but also update it later based on what is typed into that text area. And ending there with the text area, that's the last form input type we're going to look at. Covers most of the most common bases. And one thing I want to end this video with and really emphasize as we're looking at these examples is just to focus again on how Vue is very much using that declarative style of programming where we're focusing on the data and then we're relying on Vue behind the scenes to handle the mechanics. This was especially true for things like our radio buttons and our checkboxes and our selects. We didn't really have to worry about how those options were chosen. We didn't have to target them specifically and say, okay, when this value changes, update it so that this option is chosen. All we really had to do was worry about the data and think about what the data was set to. And Vue took care of everything to update the interface for us. All right, and that's really useful because that allows us to focus on our data, focus on the needs and the goals of our application without having to worry about all those little details that we would have to work with if we were working with just vanilla JavaScript. And speaking of the goals and the needs of our application, I do want to also point out that I recognize a lot of the examples in this video were really hypothetical. We haven't actually done anything with like a difficulty level chooser yet or choosing category words. But everything we're doing right now in these early videos is really just about the foundational work within Vue, understanding the basics of how to work with these different directives and tools. We have a couple more steps we have to cover in that foundation, but then in a couple videos, we're going to start to pull these pieces together. We're going to focus in more on what this FlashWord application is actually doing and see some more concrete examples on how to use these tools. So if things are feeling a little fuzzy, a little abstract right now, just hang with me. We got a few more things to cover, like I said, and then we'll start to put this to use and it'll hopefully make the pieces start to click together. The next foundational Vue topic we want to take a look at is computed properties. Computed properties allow us to compose new data derived from other data. And I have a classic example of this down here where imagine within an application, we had data properties for a user's first name and last name. And frequently throughout the application, we want to output their name somewhere on the page, but we want to combine the first name and last name together so we get their full name. To accomplish this, we can create a computed property, which you can see here. We're just going to set this within a computed option within our application. And the computed property, it's just a function we're going to add within here. And within this function, we're going to return some value. And in this case, the value we're returning is just a combination of our first name and last name data properties separated with a space in between. All right, so pretty straightforward in terms of functions. We're just accessing existing data within this particular application. But what makes this interesting is anytime first name or last name is updated within our application, this computed property will be re-invoked. We will get a refreshed value from it. Let's quickly see this in action. So I'm just going to copy this directly from the notes. I'm going to bring in the computed option. I'll add it after my data, before my methods. And then I will just initialize first name and last name as data properties. And then in my template, I'll throw in a couple inputs where we can enter a first name and last name. And then we're going to text interpolate or output an invocation of our full name computed property. And this is temporary, so I'll just add it at the very end. And let's enter a first name and a last name. And you can see our full name computed property is reactively updating as we're making changes to these values. Now, this same effect could be created using regular methods as well. And just to simulate this, let's add another method. We'll call this one get full name. And we'll have this return the same thing that our full name computed property is returning, which is a combination of first name and last name. And then we will also output this to the page. All right, so we can see both of our outputs. This is from our computed property, and this is from our method. So the end result is the same, but let's imagine that we needed to do this in multiple places throughout our application. And just right now, hypothetically, I'll simulate that. So I will output the full name computed property 3 times. And then I will output the method version get full name 3 times as well. In this situation, the computed property is going to be more optimal because behind the scenes, the data we get back from our computed properties is cached. So the very first time we invoke it, it's going to have to concatenate together first name and last name, give us the value, but then it's going to cache the results. So the next time we invoke it, we're just going to get that cached version, and then the same thing for the third time. Now, to the extent that first name or last name is updated, that will cause the full name computed property to re-evaluate. But again, it's only going to do it for the first time and then use the cached results for any subsequent uses of it. Now, the same cannot be said for methods. For each invocation of this method, it is going to have to fetch the data for first name and last name, join it together, give us the results. It'll do it again for the second time and again for the third time. It's not taking advantage of any sort of caching system. Now, in a basic example like this, you're not going to notice a performance difference between these two techniques. But of course, we want to think about our application growing more complex, scaling up. A lot more things are going to be happening in the interface. Perhaps more complicated things are happening within these functions. That's where the caching system and the optimization that Vue provides with computer properties can start to come into play. For another example and use case of computer properties, I actually want to jump back. Earlier in this series, it was in part 5, we were talking about list rendering. And one of the things we were trying to accomplish there was to render a filtered list of items by combining a v-if inside of a v-for. And let's follow this link so we can refresh our memories on what we were doing. So we had a array of Spanish words, and we were trying to just output the words that met some length criteria. For example, here we have it where we only want to output words that are less than or equal to 3 characters long. So the way we accomplished this is we started with a v-for directive to iterate through our list of words. And then within there, we had an element that we were going to conditionally display if the given word we were looking at matched our criteria. In other words, if the length was less than or equal to 3 characters. All right, so that worked, and we saw how to do that. We saw, that we wanted to nest the v-if inside some v-for. If we didn't do that, we ran into a precedence issue. But at the time, I mentioned that the better approach to doing something like this was to use computer properties. And hopefully that makes sense now, because as we saw, the idea with computer properties is to derive new data based on your existing data properties. And that's what we're doing here. We want to come up with a list of filtered words based on our Spanish words data property. Let's put this together. Let's see this in action via computer properties. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring back my Spanish words array as one of my data properties. And then I'll set up a computer property. Let's call it short Spanish words. And what this needs to do is it needs to return a version of our Spanish words data property where we filtered it down to just the words that are less than 3 characters. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm just going to use JavaScript's built-in filter method. So we'll say this Spanish words dot filter. And then the argument we're going to give it is a function that's going to act as the test as to whether each element, or in this case, each word, should be included in our filtered results. And of course, our criteria here is just whether the word is less than or equal to 3 characters in length. All right, so with that defined, let's now iterate through this computed property and output the results. So I'll go back to my template and I'll set up a unordered list. Within there, I will use a list item and our v-for directive to iterate through our short Spanish words computed property. And let's go ahead and see what this gives us. And perfect, we've got uno and dos. Looking back at our list of words, those were the 2 words that were 3 characters or less. And then of course, because it is a computed property, if we had something in this application that was, say, altering this array, we would see that this would be kept up to date so that anywhere we were invoking this computed property, we would get refreshed results whenever Spanish words was altered. Now moving on, a feature that's somewhat similar to computed properties is something called watchers. Watchers allow us to define functions that are going to be watching for a change to a particular data property. And when that change occurs, we can trigger something to happen. As an example of this, let's go back to our first name and last name example, and let's rewrite the functionality of combining those 2 things together. But instead of using a computed property for that, or even a method, we're going to use a watcher for it. And to facilitate this, the first thing I'm going to do is actually add a new data property that is going to hold the full name together. And we're going to see how we're going to set up watchers to update that. So after first name and last name, let's create a new data property called full name, which will initialize to an empty string. All right, and then down here, I'm going to add a new watch option. So I'll add it after computed, but before methods. And then I could define my watchers in here. And my watchers are just going to be functions. And I want to name them after the data property I want to watch. So to begin with, let's focus in on the first name data property. So I'll create a function called first name. And what I want to do is define what should happen whenever first name changes. And what I want to happen is I want to basically update this full name data property. So what I'll do is I'll reference this full name, and I want it to be a combination of first name and last name, just like we did in the computed property. So I'm actually just going to copy this from up here, like so. All right, so that should update full name whenever first name changes. And we want to do the same thing for the last name. Anytime last name changes, we also want to update full name. So let's copy this existing watcher. We'll name the second one last name. That's the data property we're going to be watching. And I don't have to change anything in the body of the function because the same thing needs to happen when last name changes. All right, so now to see the output of this, what I'm going to output is not the watchers themselves. I'm going to output full name, and I'm just going to rely on the watchers behind the scenes to update full name for me whenever first name or last name changes. So coming back to our template here, we'll do another output, and we'll say hello, and we'll just reference the full name data property. We don't need multiples here. I was talking about caching earlier. That's why I had multiples, but we don't need that. Basically, we just have our 3 different variations of how we're getting the first name and last name combined together. The first was with a computed property. The second was with a method. And now we're seeing an example where we're taking advantage of watchers. But regardless of the technique, the output should be the same. So let's make sure that's the case. And I'll go ahead and enter a first name and last name again. All right, you can see we're getting the same results. We are also getting warning in the console, though, that our computed property full name is already defined in data. And to understand what's going on there, let's go back to the JavaScript. This was my mistake. So I created this full name data property, but we already had a computed property called full name, and we can't have duplicate names there because when we're referencing it in things like our template, our application doesn't know, are you talking about the computed property here or the data property? There's no way of distinguishing it. So we want to be on the lookout for that. And the way I can address this, let's just say, I'll just rename it up here to first name and last name. And then I'll just update my watchers, making sure that that is the value it's actually updating. And then of course, in our template, we'll want to update it here as well. All right, that should work the same. Let's make sure, I'm going to refresh it, make sure I don't have any warnings. And it looks like everything's working as expected. All right, and with that, that gives us 3 different approaches to solving the same problem. And in terms of comparing these approaches, we've already talked about how in this situation, a computed property is more ideal than a method because we get the advantages of caching. I would also say that the computed property approach is better than the watcher just because the watch approach is more verbose. It took 2 separate functions to accomplish the same thing. And then within those functions, we had duplicate code to construct the first name and last name. So that from a coding perspective, that's obviously not ideal. That being said, there are use cases for where watchers would be ideal. And to speak to this, let's actually go back to the notes. At the very end, we have a breakdown, kind of a summary that talks about methods versus computed properties versus watchers and when you would use which approach. And as I mentioned earlier, with methods, these are most commonly used when you're reacting to some event happening, right? You're clicking a button, you're entering a key, you want to trigger something to happen. Method is going to be the go-to approach there. Computed properties are ideal in those situations where you're composing new data or some variation on existing data, especially if you want it to be reactive, right? If you're expecting the dependent data to be changing, you want to regenerate your composed data, computed properties are the tool to reach for. All right, and finally with watchers, a use case for where watchers would be ideal is if you want some action to occur in response to a data property changing, that's where watchers are good. And we'll actually see an example of this in the next video where we're going to really start to put together the FlashWord application. And one of the things we're going to do is once the user gets all of the words correct, we want to display like a global success message. And we'll accomplish that via a watcher because we're going to set up a watcher that's going to look at a data property that's going to keep track of how many correct answers we have. And once that number passes a certain point, then we'll display our global success message. All right, and that's a good use case for a watcher. So in summary, we've got several tools within Vue that often seem to have like overlapping purposes, but they definitely have different situations where they're going to excel. And this is something that as we continue through this series and we see more examples of these, I think you'll start to get a better sense of when you should be reaching for which tool. But like I just said, in the next video, we're going to take a break from learning new Vue things. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply all of the tools we've been working with up to this point and really start to flesh out the details of our FlashWord application. We've covered a lot of ground so far in the techniques we've learned within the context of Vue.js, from talking about reactive data properties to list rendering, conditional rendering, directives, event listening, computer properties, watchers, so on and so forth. There's other things we've covered as well. And we've covered it all in a bit of a mishmash of examples. So I'd like to pause here, and instead of adding new topics to our plate, I want to pull all the pieces together and build a functioning application with what we know so far. And as I mentioned at the start of the series, what we want to do is we want to build this FlashWord application. And I've actually got a live demo running of what we hope to accomplish by the end of this video. So you can see when we come to the page, we're presented with 3 words in this little card interface. And we can go ahead and enter the correct translation of the word. And then the way we check each word is we just hit enter. And if it's correct, it turns to a green box and the little text input goes away. And you can see as I answer each card, we have a counter up here telling us how many words we've gotten correct. And then once we've answered all the words correct, we get this global feedback up top letting us know it's been completed. Other features of note is that anytime you come to the application or if you refresh the page and it presents you with the words, it's going to do so in a random order. And currently I only have it showing 3 words just for the purposes of the demo, and testing it makes it very quick to answer all the words and test this completed state. But obviously now that this is working, we could expand on this. We could pull in more words. We could have 10 words, 100 words, however many we wanted to actually make this useful. But for the prototype, 3 words is enough to demonstrate that all the features are working. So that's our end goal. Coming back to the notes, if you are following along, the first thing I'm going to do to set up this example is clear out any of the existing functionality I've built into my FlashWord application so far. So let me go ahead and go through that process. So coming down here, I'm actually going to just completely wipe this app div clear. I'm also going to get rid of any of my internal styles. I'm going to be pulling in some external styles here in a moment. And then over in my JavaScript, I'll start with a blank slate for my data properties. Same thing for my computer properties, my watchers, and my methods. I'll clear all of that out. And in terms of things that I'm still keeping the overarching structure of initializing this application. So I've got my options. I've got my line down here that's creating my Vue app instance. It's getting my options. We are still mounting it to the element with the ID app, which we still have in our HTML. Of course, we're still pulling in Vue from our external CDN currently. We're still linking in our external JavaScript. Basically, all of the initial setup we did, we want to leave that as is and build upon it. All right. The other thing I want to do for setup, like I said, I've got some external CSS I want to pull from. So if you also want your example to look like mine, you can get this from the notes. I've got a link to some CSS we can pull in. And to grab a copy of this, we can click this little raw button just to get straight to the text. I'll select all of that. And then coming back to my application, I will create a new file, styles.css. I'll paste that in. And then back in my HTML, I will add a style tag that will link in that style sheet. And if you want to take a moment, you can skim through those styles just to get a sense of what I have in here. Just a bunch of classes and IDs that we'll be using as we build out our interface. Including here, you can see I've got some styling to apply to that app div where we're mounting Vue. And what I want is everything on the page to be centered within that. So actually coming back to my template, I want to take our H1, which is currently outside of that, and I'm just going to move it in there just so it'll be centered with the rest of the content. All right, so with that set up, let me load this in my browser. So I'll be ready to preview it once we start adding our features. So I'll just add a new tab and quickly locate that. And that looks good. That's our starting point. So building on this, I think our first order of business is to set up some data within this application, specifically the words that we're going to present to the visitor. And to expedite this, I went ahead and put together an array of words that we can pull in. I've set it up as an array of objects. So each object is the details for a given word. Within there, we have two properties for the word that we're going to show the user, and then the expected answer. All right, so basically the Spanish word and the English word. I also have a data property for each of the words to store a hint. This is not something we're actually going to see in our final version in this video, but it is something down at the end. I have some bonus challenges you can practice with. One of the things is to give the user the option to see that hint, so that exists if we need it. The other properties I have for each of the words is an answer property that is going to store whatever answer the user is typing in for that particular word, and then a Boolean value for correct, true or false, whether or not they got it correct or not. All right, so let's pull this in as our first data property. All right, and everything looks good there. We've got it in the correct location, correct indentation. I will note at this point that this isn't super ideal because this is a fair amount of data that we're now having to put directly in our JavaScript. I think in future iterations of this, it would be better if our words were coming from something like a database, or even if we had them in like an external JSON file that we imported, that would just make things a little bit neater. But for this first stab at it, just encoding the words directly in our JavaScript, I think is sufficient. So building on this, now that we've got our words, the next logical thing to do would be to output them on the page. To do this, though, I'm not going to just directly output words because I want to show the words in a random order each time. So I'm going to create a computed property that's going to shuffle my words, and that's what I'm going to iterate through. So coming down to our computed property section, let's define a new computed property. I'm going to call it shuffled words. And this is going to return our words, but we're going to shuffle them. So we're going to use a sort method on this, just a built-in JavaScript method, not Vue specific. And the algorithm we're going to use to sort it is going to look like this. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how this is actually doing the sorting, because in all honesty, whenever I need to randomly sort an array in JavaScript, I just go to Google and I type in randomly sort array JavaScript, and usually it takes me over to a Stack Overflow post and I find the solution that looks the cleanest, and that's exactly what I did here. So if you want to know more than that, feel free to reach out and we can dig deeper into it, but it's not really the thing we're focused on here. The main thing we just need is to get this array shuffled, and this line of code will do that for us. All right, so now that we have that, let's switch over to our template, and what we want to do is we want to iterate through that computed property, displaying each of our words. And structurally, the way I'm going to set this up is I'll start with an outer div, which I'll give an ID of cards. And the reason I'm giving it that particular ID is if we go back to the styles, you can see I've got some styling going on for an ID cards where I'm doing some CSS grid work so we can display each word in like a little card box that will show up in columns. The other style I have predefined here is a class for card, which we'll use for the individual divs within this that contains each of the words. So actually, let's set that up next. So within here, we'll create a div for each word. We'll apply the class card. And then we're going to use the v-for directive to generate multiple of these. And what we're going to be iterating through to get all of our words is going to be that shuffle words computer property that we just created. So I'm going to say for word in shuffled words, and then we'll text interpolate the word to the page. But specifically, if we just do word here, this is going to give us the full object, which if we look back at our data structure, we have several parts for each word. Really what we want here is just the Spanish word, which is represented by this word underscore a data property. So that's what we want to reference. So I'll just use our dot notation to get that property from that object. And that should be enough. Let's test this out, making sure that our words are output to the page. And excellent. There's our 3 words. Output in their little card elements with the appropriate styles. And of course, if I refresh this, we should see it giving us a random order each time. So building on this, let's next add our inputs where the user can enter their answer. So right after our word, I will add a basic text input. And I'm going to model this after the answer property for the given word. All right, so just looking back at our data structure again, we have each of our words and we have this answer property within there that defaults to an empty string. This is what we're going to attach to the inputs. The other thing we'll need is an event listener so that after the user enters their answer, they can hit the enter key and that'll prompt it to check their answer. So we'll use our v-on directive there, listen for a key up, specifically the enter key. And then when they do this, let's create a method. We'll call it check answer. And when we invoke this method, which I'll define here in a moment, we're going to need to pass over the given word we're checking. All right, this is a little different than our examples up to this point where we're only dealing with a single word. We could just invoke check answer. Now we have to be more specific. We have to say, okay, what word are we checking the answer for? So I'm just going to pass that along to this method. All right, so now switching over to our JavaScript, let's set up that method. And we will define it so it's expecting a word. And what it's going to want to do is it's going to, for the given word that we're checking the answer for, it's going to want to toggle this property correct to either true or false, depending upon whether the answer that the user has entered matches the word be, which is the English translation. So to write that, we're going to reference word, which is being passed in. We're going to reference that correct data property, and we're going to set it to a Boolean expression that's going to compare word be with the answer. And then to check that this is working, let's use this correct property as part of our interface. So the way I had shown in the demo is once they get the word correct, we actually don't see the input anymore. You just see the correct answer. So what I'll do is I'll use a v-if directive here, and I'm going to say if it's not correct, then we'll see the input. Otherwise, we're just going to output the correct answer. And what I'm outputting here is the answer because we can assume we're only going to see this if the answer is correct. The other thing I could do is just output word be because we know that's the correct answer. At this point, both of those should have the same value. So let's test this out. All right, so there's our inputs, and I'm going to enter the correct answer. I'm going to hit the enter key, and excellent. It got rid of the text input, and it's just outputting the correct answer. And we can confirm it's working for our other inputs as well. All right, so with the basics of that working, let's address some styling. What I'd like to do is once they get the correct answer, I want to turn the little card green. To facilitate this, if we look back at the style sheet, I have a class that we can apply here, correct. I also have a class for the correct answer paragraph just to remove the margin and padding, just to tighten up the design a little bit. So let's address these. And where I want to apply the correct class is actually to the outer div of the card itself, because you can see it's going to turn the background color of that div green. But of course, we only want to conditionally display this if it's correct. So this is a good opportunity to apply what we talked about with the vbind attribute, where we will bind a CSS class, and we'll use the object syntax here, which I recall the way we set this up is the property is the class that we want to potentially apply. In this case, that's correct. And then the value should be some Boolean expression that's going to indicate whether that class is going to be applied. So in this case, what we're looking at is whether word.correct is true. So we're just going to reference that. All right, so if word.correct is true, then the class correct will be applied to this element. And this line's starting to get a little bit long, so I'll just break the attributes out onto their own line just so we can clearly read everything that's going on here. And then down here on the paragraph is where we want to apply that class correct answer. And I'm not doing any sort of v-binding with the class here just because there's no conditional here. Basically, if this paragraph is displaying, we do want it to have this class correct answer. Let's check out these improvements. Perfect. So that looks good. I think there was another class I also had for the word itself that made it bold just to distinguish it from the answer. So let's add that as well. Yeah, there we go. So there's that class word I want to add. And I want this to look similar to the correct answer. So I'm also going to add a padding and margin of 0 to this. All right, so let's apply that. Wrap it around our word in a paragraph element. And check it out one more time. And that looks pretty good. I think my browser is currently zoomed in. If I zoom out, you can see what it'll look like at 100%. It looks a little bit more balanced. All right, so that's the baseline functionality of showing the words, allowing the user to enter the answer and checking it. So now let's add some of those finishing touches we saw in the demo. Things like at the top of the page, after we've completed all the words, we get this feedback message. And then when we're in the uncompleted state, we have this live counter up top telling us how many words we still have to guess. All right, now to facilitate this, the first thing I want to do is I need to get a count of how many words we're challenging the user to guess. And obviously in this basic example, I know what that is. I know it's 3 words. I could just hard code it as 3. But remember, this is just our prototype where we're working with 3 words. Ultimately, it would be nice to have more words. And maybe it's pulling from a database and we don't actually know how many words are there. Long story short, we want the application to calculate how many words we're working with. So to make that happen, let's go back to our JavaScript. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a computed property that's going to count how many words are in our data set. So after our shuffled words computed property, let's add a word count computed property. And this simply just needs to return a length count of our words data property. And I do want to note here, it's important we're doing this as a computed property. If we tried to set this up as, say, a regular data property, let's say we did something like this, word count is set to this words.length, this would not work. And in fact, I'll go ahead and show this. So let me comment out my computed property. We're going to try this as a data property and we'll see how it's going to fail. So let me go back to this is the finished demo. I'm going to switch back to our active demo here. And I'm going to refresh it. And you can see we get an error. Cannot read properties of undefined. It's trying to read length, and basically it's saying it can't read length of this dot words because at this stage in setting things up, this words is not available yet, right? Even though, we put this after we set up the words here, the way that this instance is set up by Vue, we can't reference other data properties when setting data properties. All right, so anytime you're in this sort of situation, computer properties are going to be the way to get a job like this done. All right, so let's clean that up. And to confirm that this is working as expected, let's go back to our template. And at the very top, we'll have a paragraph that says you have answered X out of, and this is where we'll output our word count computer property. And right now I've just put X here as a placeholder. We'll address this in a moment. We'll come up with some data to track how many words they've gotten correct. But right now we just want to make sure that word count is working as expected. All right, excellent. So there is the 3 as expected. I'll go ahead and zoom in on this again so we can see that better. All right, so with that working, now let's address, we need to keep track of how many correct answers they've gotten. And the way that we can do this, let's go back to our JavaScript. I think what we should do is maybe piggyback on our check answer method. And every time they get a correct answer, we could have a counter that will increment to keep track of how many correct answers we have. So to facilitate that, let's first set up a data property to keep track of how many correct answers they have. So I'll just add this after my words. Let's call it correct count, and I'll initialize it as 0. And then down here, we'll use just a basic if statement. We'll say if word is correct, then we will increment our correct count. All right, and then coming back to our template, we can output that right here. All right, so it starts off at 0, and then every time we get a correct answer, it should increment it by 1. And excellent, that looks good. All right, so now the final thing we want to do is we just want to swap out this message once they've gotten all the words correct. We want to have a message saying, congratulations, they've completed it. So for this, couple different ways I could go about this, but I want to take advantage of the watchers that we were talking about in the previous video. So I'm going to set up a watcher that's going to watch this correct count value. And then once it matches our total word count computed property, then we know the game is completed and we could get this message to swap out. All right, so let's set this up. Let's go back to our JavaScript and I'm going to set up a watcher. And remember, we always name our watchers after the thing we're watching. So in this case, we're watching correct count. So that's what we're going to call our watcher. And then within here, we're going to be checking for whether our correct count data property is equivalent to our word count computed property. And then once it is, let's set up a data property. We'll call it completed, which on initial page load will set it to false, but then once these two values match, we'll toggle it to true. And I'll go ahead and initialize this up here as one of our data properties. Another way we could write this instead of having a full if statement is we could just set completed to be a check of this Boolean expression. All right, so if these values match, completed will be set to true. Otherwise, if they don't, it'll remain false. And that's just a little bit cleaner. It's 1 line instead of 3. So now let's put this completed data property to use in our template. And what we'll do is we'll have another paragraph that if completed is true, we'll display that. Otherwise, we'll display this current paragraph that we have. And I think I have some IDs we can apply to these two paragraphs for styling purposes. If we look down at the styles, we have a correct count and a completed ID we can apply. Let's see how this looks. So there's our initial state, and I'll go ahead and complete the words. And excellent, you can see our global message toggled and everything is working as expected. And with that, that's as far as we're going to take FlashWord in this video. Hopefully this was a nice summary of all the concepts we've been looking at up until this point. A couple resources to leave you with. If you're following along in the notes, I do have a link to the final code for this example. You can find it over on GitHub. I also have some bonus challenges at the end if you want some additional practice to apply these skills we've been working with. But as for where we're going next in this series, I would consider this kind of the end of our intro foundational stuff with Vue. Starting with the next part, we're going to take things up a notch and start thinking bigger picture with our applications. For example, we're going to talk about things called components, which is going to provide a useful way to organize and really modularize the parts of our applications. And to take full advantage of that, we're going to want to also introduce a build system as part of our development process. Long story short, we still have a lot of important ground to cover, so I hope you will continue to watch along. So far, the way we've been developing our FlashWord example application is in a very rudimentary fashion, where we just have a few different files. We've got our index.html file that, of course, links into our JavaScript file and things like our CSS file. And when it comes to running it, we're just opening it directly in our browser and letting the browser render the page, show us the results. All right, we can see that here. I've got my index.html file open. You can see the path to this. It starts with file, right? We're not seeing that typical HTTP protocol that we see with websites. We're just loading a file. We've got a path to my computer. Very straightforward. This is often how we start to learn how to make websites. It's just, create the file, open it in the browser. And this works, obviously, we've gotten this far, but now we want to take things up a level and we want to integrate a build system into how we're developing our applications. And the reason we want to do this is, well, there's several different reasons and benefits we're going to get from a build system. And to go through these benefits, let me go over to the notes that accompany this video. I've got a bulleted list here that talks about some of the things we're going to get with a build system. And benefit number 1 is something called hot reloading or hot module replacement. What this is going to do is, first of all, we're going to run our sites over a local server. So instead of just opening files directly via our file system, it's actually going to run through a server. And that server is going to be listening for changes to our code files. So anytime we make a change to our code file, we save those changes, it's going to instantly reflect that change in the browser. So that's going to save us from that step of having to refresh the page and reload the entire application just to see our changes. Right, so obviously that's going to save us a lot of time when developing. The other nice thing about that is it's going to be able to maintain the state of our application, which is also going to help us streamline the development process. Because let's say, the thing we are working on right now is the final message we see once we've answered all of the words. And just to simulate this, I'll go ahead and enter all the correct answers. All right, so let's say we're working on something right now and we want to be changing something about this final completion. The way we're running things now, we'd go back to our code files, we'd make some change, and then we'd come back here and we'd have to refresh the entire interface. And then to get back to that state or that point, we'd have to go through and enter all of the correct answers again to get to that point to see if the changes we made worked as expected. Whereas with hot module reloading, it will reflect the changes and maintain the state. So we would just see the part we're focusing on up here updated without having to go through and recreate that state again. All right, so hot reloading definitely going to be a nice improvement in our development process. And it's one of those things that once you start working with it, you're going to start to wonder how you ever developed without hot reloading in place. Other benefits we're going to see is once we have a build system in place, we can work with something called single file components. This is an important part of how we can start to organize our Vue applications as they grow in complexity. It's not something we've talked about yet because we need build systems to work with single file components. So that's something that once we get our build system in place, we'll dig into single file components and you'll start to see why we use them. The next benefit we're going to see with our build system is we're going to be integrating package management into our projects. So this is going to make it really easy to pull in and manage any outside dependencies that our project needs, including things like the Vue framework itself. So instead of loading it from an external CDN like we've been doing so far, we're actually going to be pulling the Vue framework into our project. And with package management beyond just Vue, any other outside dependencies that we might need to pull in, we're going to be able to easily do that. Finally, here are some miscellaneous benefits and things we can get with a build system when it comes to processing our code files, just optimizing the development experience, optimizing the end product. There's all sorts of things that a build system provides. And we're not necessarily going to get into every specific detail I have listed here in this series. I think the takeaway I want you to have from this is just understanding that nowadays when we're building modern web applications, especially if we're dealing heavily with advanced JavaScript interfaces, we need a lot of these features. We need a lot of these tooling, and a build system is going to provide that for us. So with that, that's all the why. Why are we getting into build systems? Let's now get into the specifics, the how of it, starting with what tools we're going to use. The first tool we need to talk about is our package management tool. We're going to be using NPM or Node Package Manager. This comes from the world of Node.js, which is the server-side implementation of JavaScript, but is used heavily within just general JavaScript applications. It's not the only JavaScript focused package management tool. There are others out there that you might want to explore, but it is the one we're going to be using in the series, and it is quite common and popular. Once we have NPM set up, we'll use it to interface with something called Vite. This is the build system we're going to be using. And this is really what's going to give us access to all of these benefits that I've outlined here. All right, so knowing that, let's start off with Node Package Manager. This is something that many of you might already have installed on your computer just because it's a very common tool used in the world of JavaScript. To see if you have it installed, just open up your command line program and just run the command npm. If you get a bunch of output about how to use it, it's already installed. If you get output that says command not found, it means it's not installed, and so you'll want to follow this link I have in the notes. This will take you to the download page where you can see you've got an installer for Windows or Mac, so just go ahead and click that, download it, run the installer. It should get set up on your system. And then the only other thing you need to do, and this is specific to Mac users, is after it's installed, you just need to update something called your computer's path variable so that when you invoke npm from command line, your system's able to find it. If you've never worked with your computer's path variable, I have a separate guide on how to do that. It's pretty straightforward, so just go follow this guide. It'll take a few minutes to get that set up. But long story short, you want to take these two paths that we got with the installer, make sure they're in your computer's path variable so that when you're in command line and you invoke npm, your system's able to find it. Now, Windows users, you don't have to do this because as part of the installer, it actually updates your computer's path variable for you. So once you've gone through that installer, you should just be able to invoke npm no problem. Okay, so now that you've got npm installed, now we can turn our attention to Vite. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Vite to generate a new Vue project for us, and it's going to set us up with all of the features we need in our build system. And the way we're going to do this is via npm. So we're going to run the command npm create. We're going to reference Vite, and then we're going to tell it we want the latest version. So I'm going to copy this command, bring it over to my command line. And I'm currently in the directory where I've been putting all of the code I've been working with in this series. So this is a good place where I want to create this new project. In your case, just move to whatever directory you want to create your project. And then we can go ahead and paste that command. And it'll quickly run through an initial setup, and then it'll start to ask you some questions about the project you're going to set up, starting with the name of it. And just to distinguish from the existing FlashWord project I've created, I'm going to call this one FlashWord Vite. So I'll hit enter. Then it's going to ask me for the framework I want to use for this project. I'm going to use the down arrow to select Vue. You can see, though, that there are other types of projects. If you're working with a different framework, you could choose that here, or you could just create like a plain vanilla JavaScript project using Vite. It has options for all of these, but of course, in our case, we want to use Vue. Then we have the option of just plain Vue or Vue with TypeScript. TypeScript is something that I do recommend checking out. It provides a little bit more discipline to your applications in terms of making sure you're being more specific with data typing. A little bit beyond the scope of this particular series, though, so we're just going to stick with regular Vue. All right, and that's it. It should have scaffolded the project for us, and then the instructions it gives us tells us to move into the directory that was just created, FlashWord Vite, and then we're going to run the command npm install. This is going to pull in all the outside dependencies we need for this project. And then finally, we will run npm run dev. This is what is going to actually set up the development web server in which we're going to run this project. So let's follow these instructions, starting with changing into the directory. Then we'll run npm install. And we'll give this a few moments to run. It's right now pulling in any of our outside dependencies, including, of course, Vue, as well as some other development tools that Vite is going to be using. And then to the extent that any of those dependencies have their own dependencies, it's going to pull that in as well. Here you can see the final output on my end. You will often see a bunch of warnings, and that's fine. You could ignore any warnings. Obviously, if we had any sort of errors, we would want to take a closer look at that. But looks like everything went smoothly on my end. So then let's follow that final step, which is to actually start up our development web server. We're going to do that with the command it gave us, which was npm run dev. All right, and then that should start our dev server, and then it gives us an address where we're actually going to access this project. So now we're going to be loading this project via HTTP instead of that file protocol we were dealing with previously. So we're actually running this over a web server. You can see it's running over port 3000 in my case. You might see a different port number here. If your computer was, say, already using port 3000, it might just find a different port to use. Long story short, just take whatever address it gives you, go ahead and copy it, and let's pull it up in our browsers. And perfect. That's what we want to see at this point. This is the default splash page you see with every new Vue application generated by Vite. And now that we've seen in the browser, let's take a quick look at the code files behind the scenes. So I'm going to go over to my code editor, and I'm going to go ahead and open this up. So I'm in the directory where I generated it. I'm looking for FlashWord Vite. And we can go ahead and let me just zoom in here. You can see there's several directories and files that it scaffolds your project with, it set you up with. And one of the things it mentions in this splash page, it says edit components hello world.vue to test hot module replacement. Let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do, let me put the browser on the right side, and on the left side, I'm going to find that file it was talking about. So this is under source components hello world.vue. Right, this is one of the files that's dictating what we're seeing on the page. So let me pull this to the left. All right, so you can see here it says recommended IDE setup, and then it's got a link. That's what we're seeing over here. So watch what happens as I go through. Let's say I delete all of this content. I'm going to delete everything until the end of the template, and I'm going to save those changes in my code editor, and notice how it instantly reflects in the browser. That's hot reloading in action. And I'll show that again. I'll just enter some content, save my changes, and we automatically see that there. So definitely one of the key benefits that we get with this build system, and something I wanted to highlight right away. Beyond that, though, there's a lot of other things we should talk about with this new Vite scaffold project, starting with things like, what is this .vue file? Why are we having JavaScript and HTML and CSS all mixed into the same file? That seems a little weird. all of these other files and directories in here. What is the purpose of them? How is this application actually working? This is all ground that we still have to cover, and I'll actually dig into that in the next part of this series. This part was really just about getting things set up, getting it to this point. So that's where I'm going to wrap up this video, except for there's one last thing I want to talk about, which is just how the way that we're accessing our project via this local server is only going to work as long as it's still actively running in command line. Right, so coming back to my command line program, you could see that I ran that npm run dev command, and it's still just actively running, making the server available. We could also see output here. Every time I made a change to my file, you could see that hot module reloading was triggered. We see that logged here. All right, so as long as this is running, I can preview my work in the browser. But if I were to stop this, and the way I'll do that is I'll use the keyboard shortcut Control-C. All right, now that server is no longer running. So if I go back to the browser and try to load this, I can't load my project anymore. All right, so at this point, let's say, I had walked away from the project, I had stopped the server, but it's, a day later and I want to work on it again, I would just come back into the project and run npm run dev, restart that server, just check the address. I'm still running on port 3000 here, so I should just be able to refresh this again. And I'm good to go, ready to continue working on my project, previewing the changes, which, like I said, in the next video, we'll pick up on this. In the previous part of this series, we set up a new Vue application using the Vite build system. And in this video, what we want to do is we want to start to dig into that application, understand the structure that it gives us to start off with, and how we can start to customize it and make it our own. And specifically, what I want to do is take all of the existing FlashWord work that we've done and see how we can integrate it into our new Vite-powered Vue application. So to get started on this, the first thing I'm going to do is let me pull up my code editor, and I'm going to go ahead and actually open up both projects. So let me go into my directory where I've been working on these projects. I'm going to open the initial FlashWord application, and then I'm going to open up the FlashWord Vite application that we created in the previous video. So I'll have both of these open, and that way I can copy and paste over the code from our initial application over into our FlashWord Vite application as needed. The other thing I want to do, I've already got my initial application loaded in my browser. Let's go ahead and get the Vite version powered up. So I'm going to go over to command line. I'm currently in my FlashWord Vite directory. I'm going to run that npm run dev command we talked about previously. That should start up my Vite development server. So let's open this URL in the browser. All right, and that's where we left it in the previous video. All right, so again, our goal is to take the work we've done here and integrate it into this application. To do that, let's take a look at the code for our Vite powered FlashWord application and just get a general lay of the land of this directory and file scaffold that it's given us. And the first thing we can observe is that in the root of the directory, there's a handful of configuration type files. For example, things like package.json, this is the configuration file for our package manager, npm. And there's several things going on in here, but some key things to focus on right now are things like the dependency section. This is where we list any outside code that this project is using. And of course, because we told Vite that we wanted this to be a Vue-based project when we created it, you could see that one of the dependencies is Vue itself. And then we also have what are called development dependencies. This is just outside code that we only need when we're working on this application in development mode. In other words, once we deploy this on like a production server, when we're actually running the application and sharing it with the rest of the world, we don't necessarily need these dependencies there. So that's why those things are kept separate. But without getting too lost in the weeds there, the takeaway here is just, here's where we list outside code that we need this project to have. And to begin with, it's just Vite and Vue related dependencies. Down the road, if there's other packages we're interested in integrating into this project, we could add them here and have npm download them for us. Now, reading from this file, what npm does is it's going to download those dependencies. It's going to put it in this node modules directory. If we take a quick look at this, we can see there's actually a lot of code within here, including things for Vue and Vite, pulling from this list that we have here. The reason we're seeing more than just Vue and Vite here, all of these other dependencies, is because remember that the way dependency management works is it's a tree system, right? So even though we're saying we only need Vue, Vue itself has its own dependencies. And that's what we're seeing listed here, is these other dependencies who might have their own dependencies, so on and so forth. All right, and all of that is like NPM package management specific. To summarize for what we need to know is, again, this is where we list outside packages and code we want to use in this project. When we're running Vite and working with NPM, it's going to download that code for us and put it in this node modules subdirectory. In addition to NPM's config file, there's also a Vite specific config file that has some defaults in here. You can go to their documentation page to learn more about the different configs. All of that's more advanced stuff, not things we need to worry about initially, but if you come across a situation where you need to change how Vite is working, this is probably a file you're going to find yourself working in. Then, of course, we have some standard files we typically see in projects, things like our README file where we have information about the project itself. You can see we've got some boilerplate code here about Vue and Vite. You could go ahead and delete this and start entering information specific about whatever project you're creating. So maybe I'll just say FlashWord, and I'll put a subheading here with author information. All right, now after the README file, we also have a git ignore file. This is where we can specify any files we want to be excluding from our version control system if we're using Git, which we should be using, but that's a whole other topic. That information would go here. And then I think that's it in terms of the configuration files in the root of the directory. So let's look at this last file here, index.html. This is really the starting point of your application. This is dictating what we see when we load this application in the browser. And the first customization we can make to start to make this FlashWord is let's go ahead and replace the title. So we're going to call it FlashWord. And I'm going to go ahead and call it version 2, just to distinguish from that initial version that we created. And throughout this video, I'll do that. I'll refer to the FlashWord that we're building in Vite as version 2, and then the version that we built without Vite in the previous videos as version 1. Now, following that, in the body of the page, there's two main things going on here. The first is this div with an ID of app. This is what our Vue instance is going to get mounted to. It's very similar to what we did in version 1. If we just skip back to that, I'm going to open up the index file from version 1. We also had a div there with an ID app, which in our JavaScript, when we set up our Vue instance, we mounted it to that element. All right, we're doing the same thing here. The difference is, notice in version 1, we put like the contents of our application directly in that div. In version 2 with Vite, we're not doing that. We're basically starting with a blank slate, and any of our content is actually going to be added from our Vue and our JavaScript files. All right, and that actually brings us to the next line here where we're linking in the JavaScript for this application. And what we're linking in is this main.js file, which is within this source directory here. So let's go ahead and open that up. That's kind of the second major component we need to understand how this application is working. The first is the index file that gets loaded, and then the main.js, the JavaScript that gets pulled in. And looking at this JavaScript file, the first thing we can observe is we've got two import statements at the top of the file here. So this is a shift in how we are working in version 1. Here in version 2, we're going to be relying heavily on JavaScript's module system, which allows us to essentially divide and conquer with our JavaScript code. We can have individual files or modules that handle specific parts of the application, and then we can import them as needed. And that's actually how we're going to be pulling in the Vue functionality into our application. We're going to be importing what we need as modules. All right, and you can see that up here. We're importing this create app method from the Vue dependency. All right, and this is different from version 1. If we hop back to version 1, back to app.js, when we wanted to create our app, the way we did it is we reference it from this global Vue object. And the way we had access to that global Vue object is back in our index file, we just imported the entire Vue library from the CDN. All right, and importing this library gave us access to this Vue object, which we can access any of the Vue methods here. In this new version 2 Vite build system that we're using, it's a little bit different. We're going to pull in just the specific methods we need from Vue as we need them. And the reason we're doing this is just thinking about the final production version of our code where we want to make it as small as possible. So rather than pulling in the entire Vue library that we might not necessarily need all of, let's just pull in the individual methods we need as we need them. All right, and that's what's happening here. Now, in terms of pulling this code in from Vue, Notice here, we're just saying Vue, right? I'm not saying go look for Vue in our node module subdirectory, which is where we know the Vue library is. That's where npm put it. We don't have to specify that here. This is implied. In fact, depending on your code editor, if you hover over this, it might tell you the full path to where it's actually going to find this library. And in the case of VS Code, it does do that. You can see it. It's finding it within node modules. It's going to look within there for the Vue library. That's where it's going to locate it. And the reason it knows this and the reason it's able to automatically assume that is just because of how this project is set up, right? The fact that we have a package.json file tells my code environment that this is an npm managed project. And from that, we can assume that any outside dependencies are in this node module subdirectory. So it's going to be able to locate that. And we can contrast that to the next import statement where we're pulling in this file called app.vue. But notice we started it, the path to it with a /. Anytime you see that, it's going to look for the corresponding file within this source directory. Right? And again, this is all based on how this project is configured, how Vite set things up. It is basically saying the source directory is the main location where we're going to be writing our JavaScript code. And the way we can reference that when we're doing our imports is just with this /. All right, so in summary, we've got two modules we're pulling into main.js. The first is just what we need from the Vue library, the create app method. And the second is this file called app.vue. And within this file, this is where we're going to define the options of our Vue instance. In fact, you can see that here. We're saying create app, and we're passing it this app object that we're getting from this app.vue file. All right, and remember, the options are just how we configure our Vue instance. This is where we define things like our data properties, our computed properties, our watchers, our methods. All of those things we've talked about in this series leading up to now are set up in our options. And in version 1, let's revisit that and see how we had set up our options there. Right, so here's our create app method in version 1. We just passed it this object called FlashWord, which we just defined right above, right? We created a basic JavaScript object. And again, our data properties, computed properties, watchers, all of those things that our Vue instance needs to know about, we set them up and then we passed it to the create app method. Here in version 2, all of that work of setting our options, we just outsourced it to this other file called app.vue. And then that's what we passed to our create app method. All right, so knowing that, let's crack into app.vue and see what's going on there. Like, what is a Vue file anyway? This is not an extension we've dealt with. It's not a JavaScript file or an HTML file. .vue, what is it? Well, let's open it up. We'll find it in our source directory, of course. And within this file, we're going to see three things. We're going to see a section of JavaScript code at the top, followed by a bit of HTML code wrapped in this template element, and then finally some CSS styles and a style element. And in the land of Vue, this is referred to as a single file component, or an SFC for short. And the idea with single file components is to organize the parts of your application into these components. And within the components, you have all of the pieces you need for that individual component, including the JavaScript, the HTML, and the CSS. To visualize this, think about an application. You have things like, let's say you have like a navigation bar. That could be a single component that has its own HTML, its own CSS, and its own JavaScript. You might also have, let's say, like a little notification menu that alerts users when they have new messages and other, events on the website. That could be its own component with its own JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And you can organize your application around these components and then join together in these single file component files all the code you need for those components. And at first glance, this might seem a little weird because when we are typically learning about web development technologies, we're taught to keep things like HTML and JavaScript and CSS separate, right? There's this whole philosophy of separation of concerns. We keep them separate. Well, with single file components, we're really breaking that paradigm, or we're shifting it, right? We're not breaking it because we're still organizing our application around these different concerns, but instead of dividing it based on the technology, we're dividing it based on the components of our application. All right, this is going to have a lot of conveniences because, imagine you're working on that notification menu. Wouldn't it be nice if rather than switching from 3 different files to work on the different parts of that, you had it all in one central location? That's the idea of a single file component. Now, in this case, I just described this idea of breaking your application into different components, and that's the point of single file components. But in this case, when we're dealing with this app.vue single file component, you can think of this as like the parent component, And its job is to give us the overarching setup of the application. And then as needed, it can pull in the subcomponents that we'll need. So when we get to having things like a navigation, or we build like a notification menu like I was talking about, those can be in their own components that we can then import and use here. And in fact, we can see a sneak peek of that in this example they set us up with. There's this hello world component that it imports, and you can see how it's using it. It's actually able to use it just like a regular HTML element, right? You can kind of think of components as just like custom HTML elements, and you define how they work in terms of their structure and their HTML, any sort of interactivity with their JavaScript, and of course how they look with their CSS. All right, so that's the role in app.vue. So it's within this file that we want to set up our options. So what I'm going to do, let me go back to my app.js for my version 1, and I'm going to take all of the options I've come up with here, and I'm just going to grab the object itself. So starting with a curly bracket, coming down here to the end, the closing curly bracket, I'm going to copy this. I want to bring this into app.vue. This is obviously JavaScript code, so I'm going to write it in the script section. And I'm actually going to delete all of this existing script code that they've given us. We're not going to use the hello world component. We're going to, we'll create our own components later on. But for now, we're going to start with a blank slate. We're going to put in our options. And these are going to be the options of this overarching app component. And what we want to do is we just want to preference this. We want to say export default. And the reason we want to do that is because the way we're using this module or component is back in our main.js, we're importing it. Right, we're importing app from app.vue. So what's going to happen is whatever we export from here is going to be available via this app object. And then once we get that, when we invoke Vue's create app, we're going to pass along that app object, passing it the options of our application. Now jumping back to app.vue, modification we need to make here is in our script element, it has this setup attribute. We can go ahead and delete that. That existed because when Vite set up this project, it set it up to use something called the Composition API, which is one style that we can work with when building Vue applications. So far, though, we've been working with a different style called the Options API, hence all the options we've created here. And in that case, we don't need that setup attribute there. Later in the series, I will talk about the Composition API, why you might want to use it versus the Options API. And in that case, we would bring back that setup attribute. But right now, based on how we're building things, we want to get rid of that. But moving on, the next thing we need to address in this app.vue single file component, if we scroll down to the template section, this is where we need to set up the structure of this component. And where we're going to get this content, if we go back to version 1 to our index file, we want to grab all of this code that we wrote within our div ID app. That's going to make up our template. So starting with our H1 and then ending with our cards div, I'm going to copy that. And then app.vue, I'm going to replace the boilerplate template content they give us with our code. All right, so we've got our JavaScript, we've got our HTML structure, our HTML template, and then the final thing I want to pull in is our styles. So in version 1, I'm going to open up my styles.css file. We had it separate there. We're going to actually be incorporating it into this app component, and I'm going to paste that right there. And with that, we should have all the pieces we need to actually see a working version of FlashWord in this new Vite setup. So let's go over to the browser. Let's check that out. And there we go. Because of hot module reloading, you can see it already refreshed for me. I didn't even have to hit refresh. And sure enough, there's our FlashWord application. Let's go ahead and test it out. All right, perfect. It looks like it's working just as it did in our first iteration. We can see our completed message there as expected. We could even highlight what I was talking about in the previous video in terms of how it maintains the state of your application as it reloads. So for example, let's go back and change the text for this message. So let's go back into our template. And let's say instead of good work, we'll just say great work. I'll save those changes, come back in the browser, and you can see it's already refreshed there. So it updated that content while maintaining the state of the application, just making that whole development process a lot smoother than having to do a full refresh, enter all our answers just to see our final results again. And with that, I think this is a good stopping point. Remember, our goal with this video was just to get our existing FlashWord application up and running in this Vite setup, and we've successfully done that. To conclude things, let me just run through from the beginning, how we got to this point, because it is a little bit different than how we set things up in version 1. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. So let's rewind. Remember, everything starts with the index.html page. Here we define a element in which we're going to mount our Vue instance, and then we pull in our main.js file. Within our main.js file, we pull in what we need from the Vue library, which right now is just the ability to create a new Vue instance, which we do via the create app method. Right down here, we invoke it. We've got to pass it all the options for our new Vue instance. And the way we're setting up our options in this context is we're using the single file component system. So we have this app.vue as our primary single file component. And within there, we have all the ingredients we need. We have our JavaScript with all of our Vue options. We have our HTML template that's going to be used, and then styling to apply to that. Right, that gets created, and then it gets mounted to our app element on the page, and that's how we see the content within the body of the page. And with all of this, I guess the last thing I want to highlight is I recognize that the organizational structure here is quite different than how we set things up in version 1. But the underlying Vue code, that was all the same. Right? Everything in our JavaScript options, we just copied and pasted that over. Same thing with our template. We didn't have to change any of our directives or any of our attributes or things like that. That was all the same. We're just pulling it into this different organizational structure that's a little bit more complex than how we did things in version 1, but it's all setting us up on a path for building more complex applications so we can take advantage of JavaScript modules, of Vue single file components, all of these organizational things that we'll come to appreciate as our applications grow in complexity. So let's wrap things up for this video. In the next video, we will spend the entire video talking more specifically about these single file components, these .vue files, get more comfortable working with them, and hopefully by the end, really come to appreciate their utility. In the last part of the series, we saw our first example of a Vue single file component. Specifically, we're working with this file app.vue. And within here, we saw that we joined together all of the JavaScript, HTML, and CSS that we needed for this component into a single file. Now, in the case of app.vue, this is like our parent component that lays out the overall foundation for our application. What we're going to see more commonly, though, with components is the idea is to really divide and conquer, to think about the individual entities within your application and turn them into their own components. And to visualize this, here in the notes, I have a generic diagram for a website where we can imagine different parts of the application being managed by separate components. For example, you could have a component for your navigation, a component for a notification menu, as well as things like a little search widget. Right? And there's several advantages to this. One, just from a development perspective, it helps us break down the complexity of our application and really just focus on the individual pieces. Additionally, once we've done this, it makes it really easy to reuse code throughout our application because we have these nice self-contained units that we can just import and use as needed. And we can actually see that demonstrated in this diagram as well. If we zoom in on things like our notification menu component, we could see how the individual notification items that we might want to display could also be designed into their own single file components and just repeated as needed. So hopefully at this point you can start to see the utility of single file components. Let's dig into some more examples though to see them in action. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to revisit our FlashWord code and extract everything to do with our little individual word cards into their own components. To do this, let's head over to our code base, and I'm going to find the components directory within our source directory, and I'm going to create a new file here. And I'm going to call this wordcard.vue. All right, so of course, all of our single file components that are always going to end with a special .vue extension. In terms of naming of components, the convention is to use Pascal case styling. So the first letter of each word is going to be capitalized. And the other convention is that our component names are typically going to always contain at least 2 words, right? So the demo component they gave us was called Hello World. And this one, we didn't just call it word.vue, we're calling it wordcard.vue. The reason that this convention exists is because when we go to use our components, which you'll see in a moment, we're going to treat them like regular HTML elements, right? That's kind of what we're doing. We're creating our own custom little elements. And we want to be able to distinguish from our custom elements from just default HTML elements. And in the world of HTML, HTML elements are always single word named, right? You've got body, head, paragraph, H1, right? It's always just this like single word. So with our custom elements we're creating via these components, we're going to distinguish from that by using multi-word names. If you want to learn more about these conventions, I do have a link in the notes that accompany this video that goes over to the Vue documentation that gets into this. But to keep things simple, just remember two things. It's Pascal case styling, and aim to have at least 2 words as part of your component name. So with this file set up, let's start to write out its contents. And like any single file component, we're always going to have a section for our JavaScript, a section for our HTML, which we'll put in a template element, and then finally any CSS styles. And to this style, I'm going to add a attribute called scoped. What this is going to do is it's going to make it so that any CSS styles we're writing in here will only apply to content within the single file component. It provides a way to basically isolate our styles. And then that way we don't have to worry about thinking about class names and ID names that are used throughout the application. We can really just focus on this particular entity. Everything is going to be scoped in this particular context. So with this scaffold laid out, let's start to fill in the details. Let's start with a template, the actual structure for our word card. And for this, we could just go back to app.vue because we've already designed what the word card structure should look like. It's this div right here. So I'm just going to take this out of app.vue and move it over into our component. With our HTML set up, let's turn our attention to our JavaScript. And what we're going to do, just like we did in our parent component, is we are going to export an object of options that are specific to this component. All right, and that's an important thing to understand. Our individual components, you can think of them as individual Vue instances with their own set of Vue options. All right, so let's set that up. We'll do export default. We're going to export a object from here. And in terms of what options we're going to need, let's go again back to app.vue and see what of the things we've already written here are specific to the word card. And so let's look at our data first. Of course, we've got the words themselves, but what's going to happen is when we actually invoke this component, we're going to pass in the individual words. So we don't need to set that up as a data property. We have some computed properties that are going to shuffle the words and get a count of all the words. And again, that's thinking about all the words. Here where you just want to focus on individual words. So I don't think we need any of those computed properties. We don't need the watcher for correct count. The correct count is really specific to something that's beyond the context of the word card. So we don't need that. Down here in methods, this check answer method, though, I think this is a good candidate for bringing this into our word card component because checking an answer is very much part of the functionality of the word card. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's copy this and we're going to add it to our options here. And there's a couple modifications we're going to need to make to this method, but for now, let's finish filling in the rest of our options. And there's actually 2 new options I want to introduce in this subcomponent. The first is we want to give it a name option. And I'm just going to name it after the file itself. So I'm just going to call it word card. And where this is going to be used is when we invoke this single file component from app.vue, we're going to reference it by this name. The other option I want to introduce is something called props. And what props allow us to do is to pass in information to a component when we're using it. And how I want to use it in this particular case is I need to tell this component which word it actually needs to be working with. So the prop I'm going to define here is called word. And the syntax I'm defining this or using is I'm defining it as an array because the idea is we might have other properties that we could introduce to this component. But for right now, we just need word. With those options set up, there's a couple things we'll have to come back to this component to tweak to get this working. But for now, let's turn our attention back to app.vue where we're actually going to use this component. And the first thing I want to do to make the word card component available here is I'm going to import it. So at the top of the file, we'll just add a import statement. We'll say import word card from, and then we will reference our source directory. Remember, we could do that with the // shortcut. We're going to look within there for our component subdirectory and our wordcard.vue file. Next, in order to use this component, we just need to register it with this Vue instance. And we're going to do that with a new option called components. And we could set it to an object and to specify the components we want to use, which in this case, it's word card. Now that that's imported and registered, coming down to our template in our cards div, each of the individual cards, which was previously just handled by this div, we're going to remove that and instead use our new word card component. And as you can see, we just treat it like a regular HTML element. We use a start tag and an end tag, and anywhere we're using this, it's going to inject our component into the page. Of course, though, we don't want just a single word card. We want one for each of our words. So we're going to generate multiple of these using our v-for directive. We're going to say word in our shuffled words computed property. And then to get the individual word to the word card, we're going to use the prop that we had set up. And the way we pass a prop is we're just going to bind it like any other data. So we're going to use the vbind attribute. And what we're binding is the word property. And we're going to set it to be whatever the word is as we're iterating through. And now that we see this v-for in action here to display each of our word cards, I need to actually jump back to our word card component, because when we pulled in the div or the structure for the word card here, we still had the v-for there, which made sense that we had it when it was in this context of app view. But here in the component context, we no longer need that because we're really just focusing on the individual card here. So I'm going to get rid of that v-for. The other modification we can make here is when we're invoking check answer, we don't need to tell it what word to check for because we should know what the word is based on the prop. So I'm actually going to remove that parameter from this method. I'll remove it up here as well. And then to support this change, the only other thing I need to do is anytime we're referencing word here now, we just need to reference it from the context of this instance. So we're going to prefix it with that this keyword. All right, so just keep that in mind. Anytime you're referencing the prop data that's being passed in, you'll just reference it as this dot whatever that prop data is, very similar to how you would with just a regular data property. And with that change in place, the last thing we want to do before we test this out is pull in the styles that are specific to this component. So again, going to app.vue, we're going to pull some code over from there. Specifically, I'm going to look through the styles and find the classes and the selectors that are relevant to our word card. So we've got this card class, the text input styling, the word itself, and then I think the correct answer is also in our template. Let's check this. Yeah, so we are using that class there. So we'll grab that as well. And then finally, the correct class. So I'm going to take all of that out of my parent component, move it over here to word card. All right, so saving those changes, let's pull this up in the browser. Let's see how we're doing. Looks like we might have an error in our application because as you can see, we're just getting a blank white screen. So something is preventing it from loading. Let me pull up the web inspector to see if we can figure out why. Go over to the console. Yeah, we do have a syntax error. This is happening on line 6 in app.vue. So let's see what I did wrong there. And it looks like I just forgot a comma after my components option before I got to my data option. So I'll just add that, save those changes. And in this scenario, I do have to refresh the page to see the changes just because that fatal syntax error prevented the application from ever even loading, and therefore the hot module replacement couldn't occur. So I'm going to give this a fresh start. And excellent, we're not getting any errors in the console, and it looks like we've got our word cards showing up as expected. Let's test out their functionality. And perfect, it looks like our word cards are operating as expected. The global feedback up here, though, is not operating as expected. You can see it didn't increment. It didn't give us our final completion message. To understand why that is, let's go back to our code base. And the first thing I want to do, going back to the parent component app.vue, we still have a check answer method in here, which you'll recall one of the first things we did is we took this and moved it over into our word card single file component. So I want to get rid of this. It's not actually being used within this component anymore. When we invoke check answer here in from our input by hitting the enter key, it's going to be invoking the check answer method within this component. So we don't need that anymore. I'm going to get rid of that to avoid any confusion. And then turning our attention to the check answer method within the component, we need to talk about how it's trying to communicate information about the parent component's data. Specifically here, when the word is correct, it's trying to update correct count. But in the context of this component, correct count doesn't exist. It's not a prop that we've passed in. It's not a data property that we've defined local to this instance. Correct count is something that is defined and exists in the context of app.vue. So what we need to figure out how to do is how to communicate from this child component to the parent component that it needs to update its own correct count. And the way we're going to do this is with something called events. We can trigger an event from a component that would send information up to the parent or the calling component. It's kind of the opposite of props, right? Props was how we got information from a parent component to a child component. With events, we're going to be able to communicate information from the child component to the parent component. The way that we're going to set this up, the way that events work, is within here, rather than just trying to directly increment correct count, we're going to emit an event. And the way we do that is we're going to reference this current Vue instance, and there's a special method called emit. It starts with a $. And then we're just going to come up with a custom event name. And in this case, I'll just call it increment correct count. Then in the parent component, what we want to do is when we're using word card, we want to set it up to listen for that event. So I'm going to use the v-on directive, but rather than listening for a click or a key press or any kind of standard event, we're going to listen for that custom event that we just created, increment correct count. And when that occurs, we need to trigger some action. And the action we will trigger, let's go ahead and add a method that its only job is going to be to increment that correct count value. So just to keep things consistent, we could also just call this method the name of the event itself. So its job is to take our correct count data property and just increment it by 1. All right, so down here, when this event is triggered from the child component, we want to invoke this method. Let's test this out. I am going to do a refresh on the page just because I actually have to go through and answer the words correctly to trigger that event and the increment count method to actually see our data change up here. So we'll start with the blank slate, enter a word correctly, and excellent. We can see our counter is going up. And then there's our final completion message. And with that, we're basically right back where we started from at the beginning of this video in terms of the application itself. But behind the scenes, we have successfully reorganized things and divided and conquered so that everything related to the word card is now handled via its own single file component. And to wrap up this video, let's just highlight some of the key things we learned. The first just being this idea that a single file component is really just its own little Vue instance with its own options, its own template, and its own CSS. And other key things we learned was just about communication with components. So when we want to pass in information to components when we're utilizing them, we could do that by setting props. And then on the reverse, when we want to communicate information from the component to some parent component, we can do that with custom events. Another key thing I want to recap and emphasize about single file components is just this whole paradigm of separation of concerns. This was something I talked about in the previous video about how in our first introduction to components, it might seem like we're breaking separation of concerns because we're combining JavaScript, HTML, and CSS within one file. But remember, we're not breaking separation of concerns so much as we're just changing how we're thinking about separation of concerns, where we're separating based on the functionalities of our application rather than just arbitrarily based on the technologies. That being said, there are some situations, though, where you will want to still separate based on the technology, specifically with CSS, right? You might be in a situation where in an individual component, there might be some global styles that you want to rely upon. And if that's the case, you can still do that. You can actually link in external styles into your single file components. You're not restricted by having to explicitly define all the styles here. All right, so the long story short, you have flexibility and options in terms of how you want to organize things. Same thing with the JavaScript. You could import other JavaScript code into this component if things started to get really complex and you wanted to break things down further. You have that option to do that. And then the final point I want to make is actually jumping back a couple topics ago when we first introduced build systems. I just want to highlight how everything we're doing with single file components is only possible because we're working with build systems. Because what's happening behind the scenes, when our code base is being compiled by our Vite build system, there are special handlers there that are dealing with this .vue file. It knows what to do with the script and the template and the style and how that gets combined together. If we weren't working with a build system, let's say we were back in the early days of this series where we're just trying to load things directly in our browser, we wouldn't be able to write code like this because our browser doesn't know what a Vue file is. It doesn't know what to do with this code. We need that processing step that a build system gets that allows us to work in this particular structure. And I just mentioned that now just because it was one of the benefits we briefly skimmed over when introducing build systems, but it was really kind of hard to appreciate until you've seen single file components in action. So hopefully now, having seen this, you understand beyond just things like hot reloading, what are the advantages of working with a build system. We get organizational structures like single file components. Beyond that, though, this is as far as we're going to go with components in this video. Looking forward, the next topic we're going to be tackling in the series is the composition API. This is something I've alluded to a couple times as we've gone through and written our code, and it's definitely an important thing to understand as a Vue developer. So that is what we will tackle next. So far, all of the work we've done in this series has been using Vue's Options API. The way that the Options API works is within our Vue instances, we create an object, and within that object, we define special options that set up our instances. For example, we have options for our reactive data, which we set up via the data option. We also have things like computed properties, our watchers, our methods, basically all of those special Vue tools that are provided for us, we can define them as options within this object. And this way of organizing our application works fine in this simple example so far, but imagine we started to expand on this and add more features. Right, so let's say we added a feature that was keeping a score of our progress, where for more difficult words, we got more points and everything was added up. And maybe there's some point threshold we're looking to pass, something like that. If we started to integrate that, we would have to start to add more code for that feature. So within our data properties, we would add additional data properties for our score calculator. We might have some computed properties to work with that as well. We might have watchers. Whatever we need to make that happen, we would have to integrate that into this structure. And as we did that, what would happen is we would then be splitting the code for a given feature over these different options. Right, so we'd have some code for the first feature, which was our global feedback message, and then we'd have some code here for our second feature, which was the high score. And we would see this in each of our options. So the end result is, as we're focusing on different features, we'd have to be jumping around to the different options, the different utilities that Vue provides to find the code for the feature that we're focusing on. And that can start to get a little confusing. To address this, Vue introduced another style of defining your Vue instances called the composition API. And what the composition API is going to allow us to do is essentially extract these Vue utilities separate from this object syntax so that we can define them organized around our features. And to envision this, let me just write a little hypothetical code up here. What it's going to look like this is, imagine we have feature A, and then within feature A, or within a section of code about feature A, we can define our data properties. We can define our computed properties, any of our methods, so on and so forth. We can define everything we need for feature A. And then after that, then we can focus on feature B and have its own set of data properties, its own set of computed properties, methods, watchers, etc., separate from feature A. Right? So then everything is organized together around the feature rather than divided out amongst these options. And the end result is a more logically structured application that's really going to be useful, again, as your application grows in complexity. And speaking to that, before we actually get into the composition API, just a little bit of history. The composition API was released in version 3 of Vue. Prior to that, the only thing we had was the options API. And, speaking to that and hearing that history, you might wonder, well, is the options API still relevant? Why not just do everything in the composition API? And the answer to that question, it is very much still relevant in, small to medium scale applications. The options API is perfectly sufficient You're going to find a lot of developers are still creating projects using the Options API. There's lots of resources and tutorials online about the Options API. So it's a really good way to get into Vue, and it's important to know to understand how to work with Vue in general. But layering on the Composition API as a different style of structuring your applications is something that is worth looking into as you get further into your Vue development experiences, which is why we're covering it here towards the end of this series. Another preface I'll mention before we jump into our example is that if you're following along in the Vue documentation, you can actually toggle between the Options API and the Composition API in terms of instructions. I referenced this here in the notes that accompany this video. You can see a screenshot. Let's actually go over to the docs and look at this. All right, so here's that toggle. So if you're working in the Composition API, just make sure it's set to that. And then any of the instructions you're reading, when it's talking about syntax, it's going to give you the syntax in the Composition API, whereas the Options API, you could toggle back to that as needed. Now, let's jump into our example. And what I'd like to do is just refactor our FlashWord application to use the Composition API. And to do this, I'm actually going to make a copy of our existing application and work in that copy, just because we're kind of going in a different direction with the application. So I want to keep that original copy written in the Options API just to have it for reference as needed later. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our FlashWord Vite directory that we've been working with. We're going to duplicate it into a new directory called FlashWord Comp API. And that's where we're going to be making all the changes that I'm going to be going over in this video. So following along in the notes, I'm going to borrow this command to copy that directory. I'm over in my command line window. I'm in the directory where all of my work I've been doing in this series exists. So I'm about to make a copy of this directory. So I'm going to paste that command and then list my directory contents again. You can see I now have FlashWord Comp API. So I'm going to move into that directory. And what I want to do is I want to clear out my node module subdirectory. Recall that this is the directory that npm manages. And right now, this has some code in it that's referencing the original FlashWord Vite directory. We want to basically redo any of those references to reference our new directory name. So we're just going to remove it and then have npm rebuild it in this new directory. All right, so to remove that, we'll do the remove command. We'll make it recursive, so it removes everything in the directory, and we're removing node modules. All right, and then we're going to have node rebuild it, and we're going to do that with the command npm install. Give that a few moments to run. All right, we can ignore any warnings as we did when we first set up the project. We do want to just skim through here and make sure we don't have any errors, which we don't, so it looks like we're good. We can look at our directory contents again, and you can see that node modules directory is back. So now the next thing we'll do is we'll run npm run dev to start up our Vite development server within here. And it looks like I do have an error preventing this from starting just because of the little bit of pseudocode I was adding when I was talking a moment ago. So let me go clear that up. I'm going to first clear it up in my FlashWord Vite version so I can get rid of these notes and then these little periods here I did to represent new code. I'll get rid of that. All right, and the error that's coming here is actually in my duplicated version. So I've got to add that to my working environment in my code editor here. So I'm going to say File, Add Folder to Workspace, and I'm just going to open up this new Comp API directory. And then I need to go in and find that app.vue file and make the same fixes here. All right, so that should be good. Let's go back and try to rebuild that. So I'm going to run npm run dev again. Perfect. So we've got our dev server running. Let's bring this up in the browser. All right, excellent. And this should just be working exactly as we left this application off in the previous video. So with that example set up, let's start with this app.vue file, updating it to use the Composition API. And the way I'm going to do this is coming back to the notes for this video. I've actually got the code written for this out. So I'm going to bring this over, and then we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of the two different approaches. So I'm going to grab everything, starting with the starting script tag down to the closing script tag. In my code editor, I'm just going to make sure I'm in app.vue in my new version, in my FlashWord Comp API version, and I'm going to replace the script with what I just copied. And then I want to see these two files side by side. So I'm going to use my code editor's split pane feature. And then let's close out this tab. So the end result is here on the left, we have app.vue from our original version written using the options API. And then on the right is our new version in our comp API folder written using the composition API. Just so I can see these better, I'm going to close the file browser. And then the other thing I'm going to do is for our words definition, because it's a somewhat long object, I'm just going to use the collapse feature just to condense that, just so we can see a better bird's eye view of everything in these files. And you can see here on the left in my original version, it's already collapsed, so that's what it did look like, and then it's been collapsed down. So with everything laid out in front of us, let's talk about the key differences between these different approaches. And the first difference you should observe is that in the options API, we're creating this object that we're exporting, and within that object, we're defining special Vue utilities like our data properties, computed properties, watchers. Whereas in the composition API, the way we're accessing those Vue utilities is via these methods that we're importing. Right, so there's three methods we're importing from the Vue library: ref, computed, and watch. First method, ref, is how we're going to set up our data properties. You can see that down here. We've got 4 data properties, which we're setting up just as regular JavaScript constants. We're setting them to be an invocation of that special ref method, and then to that we pass the value we want to initialize it as. So when we see a line like const correct count, and we set it to be ref of 0, this is the equivalent of what we did here in the options API, where within data we said correct count 0. And with this, we should see all the same behavior that we saw with our data properties, and that it's going to be reactive. All right, so if correct count is altered somewhere else in this code, anywhere we're using correct count, we should see those alterations, those changes propagated and reflected wherever we're using it. Moving on, we've got computed properties, which you'll recall computed properties are basically just special functions that are going to be automatically invoked whenever data that we're referencing in those functions is changed. All right, so the way that we define our computed properties in the composition API is, again, we're just going to create a constant. We're going to set it to this computed method, which we're importing from the Vue library, and then we're going to pass it the function that needs to be executed when its dependent data changes. All right, so the internal workings of this function we're setting it to is very similar to what we saw in our original version in terms of like the general algorithm of what we're doing here. One notable difference, though, is how we're referencing data within these functions, specifically our data properties. In the options API, we had to reference our data properties via the special this keyword. All right, and that's because we were working in this object syntax. So if we wanted to reference other data within this object, we got to it via the this keyword. In the composition API, we're not working in this object syntax, so we don't use the this keyword, but we do have to include this additional value accessor. All right, we can't just access our computer property words directly. We have to get the value within there. The reason we have to do this is because when we set up a reactive reference using this ref method, it's creating an object from this. And within that object is all the functionality we need for our reactive data. So for us to get to the underlying value here, we just have to access it with this special value keyword. All right, from there, though, the algorithm's the same. We run our sorting function, we return that. Everything else works the same. We just reference our data properties within these functions a little bit differently. Another computer property example we see is our word count. And again, same principles here in terms of how we're setting this up. You can see we're accessing words again here. To get to the underlying value, we just say words.value, whereas in the options API, we accessed it via this.words. After computed properties, we get onto watchers. And again, this is something we're importing from the Vue library. We're importing the special watch method. And in this case, we're not going to define a constant here because we're not like creating a watch value. Instead, we're just going to invoke this watch method and tell it what we want to watch. So what we want to watch is the correct count. And the second argument we're passing this watch method is parameters for what the new value is when correct count gets updated, as well as what it previously was. And this is not actually something we did in the options API version, just because we didn't actually need to know that information. But if we did, just in the sake of making these two things the same, we could include them as parameters here as well. But it's not something we need internally in this function, so technically we don't need it in either of these versions, but just nice to know that you can access that data when working with watchers. And then finally, the last utility we needed was just to create a regular method. And in the options API, we do put that under the methods option. But here in the composition API, we just define a regular method, just like we would any other JavaScript method. There's nothing special we need to import from Vue to make that happen. Just a plain old JavaScript method. Of course, within there, we can access our data properties that we've defined, so you can see how that is being used to update our correct count. But the method itself is just a plain JavaScript method. And that brings us to the end of our script and our JavaScript changes. If we continue to scroll down, we can look at the HTML template, which we didn't change anything there. And so that's an important thing to understand. Whether you're using the composition or the options API, how you write your template and work with your Vue directives is going to work the same, including things like accessing data properties and computed properties. Because in the template, you never had to use things like the this keyword there. Same thing with the composition API. You don't have to use the special .value method to access the data. Basically, when this component is rendered by your build system, it's automatically going to reveal those underlying values for you, so you can just directly reference them. Now, a few minor points I want to cover in terms of differences here. Let's rewind a bit. I want to go to the very top and point out that when we're working with the composition API, we do want to include this special attribute called setup as part of our script. This just saves us a couple steps. It's just telling our build system that this is using the composition API, and that is going to handle all of these constants that we're defining here and making sure that they're going to be registered properly when we're using this component. If we don't include this setup attribute, we would actually have to set up our application similarly to how we did with the options API, but we would add this extra setup method here, and this is where we would define our data properties, computer properties, watchers, so on, and then we'd have to return them. It's just more syntax that we'd have to worry about. So this setup attribute here just kind of makes some magic happen in terms of our application and simplifies the amount of code that we have to write. But long story short, just include it there when you're using the composition API. Another small difference between these two approaches is in the options API, when you're importing other single file components to use, you do have to explicitly register them as part of your options. Whereas with the composition API, we don't have to do that. All we have to do is import that single file component, and then it's available for use. So down here in our template, when we're using the word card, this should just work as expected. No registration step needed. In fact, let's test this out. Let's make sure that the code we've written here is actually working in this version. So coming back to the browser, let's actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to update the title here just to make sure it's clear I'm running the correct application. So let me bring back my file browser. And I'm going to go into the index file within my comp API version. And I'm going to update this, and we'll call it FlashWord Composition API. So we're going to save that. And then there we go. We can see the title updated there, so we know we're working in the right version. And just going to go through and test all of our functionality. And looks like all of our word cards are showing and working as expected, as well as all of our completion message features that we were working with in app.vue. And with that working, let's just recap and make sure we understand the difference between the options API and the composition API, specifically what it's getting us. And to do this, let's go back to the notes that accompany this video. I've got a section down here under what does this get us that reiterates some of the points I was making at the beginning of this video of just how the composition API allows you to organize your application around features rather than options. And here I'm imagining a hypothetical. Let's say we're building an e-commerce site and we had two features, a search feature and an add to cart feature. If we were working with the options API, this is how we would have to organize our code. where within our data options, we would have all the data for our search feature, and then we'd have to have all the data for our add to cart feature. Same thing with our computer properties. We'd have to divide out what we needed for that for our respective features. And the end result is that the code for our different features is spread throughout the application, right? So in 3 separate places here, we have all the code for our search features. In 3 separate places, we have all the code for our add to cart. So you end up having to jump around a bunch. Whereas if we imagine this refactored in the Composition API, we could build all the code for our search feature in one spot where we have our reactive data, computer properties watchers. Same thing for add to cart. We could organize all of the utilities it needs together. And then this just makes for a much more logical outline of our application. Another advantage beyond organization is just that Composition API opens us up to better code reusability, because we're able to access our Vue utilities outside the context of a Vue instance. And when we can do that, we can create like dedicated function files that handle specific features and then just import them as needed into our components, into our Vue instances. This is often referred to as composition functions, which it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about in this intro video here, but I did just want to mention it that, again, beyond organization, the other thing that the Composition API opens us up to is just better reusability and modularity when it comes to our code, which is always a good thing as we're thinking about bigger and more complex applications. Now, to wrap up this discussion, the last thing I would like to do is let's also update our word card single file component to use the Composition API, just because there's a couple additional features I want to talk about when it comes to working with child components in terms of working with things like our props and the ability to emit events to parent components. So again, to expedite things, I'm just going to copy this pre-written code from the notes. So I'm going to grab everything in the script element. And then let's open up our word card component, making sure I'm in the comp API version. And I'm going to replace the existing script element with this updated version. And let me close this other pane just so we can focus on this file. And before we dig in the specifics here, let me actually jump back to the component within the Options API context, just to refresh our memory of what we've got here. So we've got a component. The main thing going on here is we have a prop called word that we're making accessible within this component. So when it's invoked by a parent component, that parent component needs to provide this information. And then within here, we just had a method to check answer that is going to reference that word prop. It does it via the this keyword. And that's really it here. We weren't doing anything with computer properties or watchers, just a method and a prop. Right, so now the equivalent in the Composition API is here's how we're going to define props in the Composition API. We're going to use this special define props function, or they call it a macro. And that just means it's going to be globally available in your components, assuming you are using the setup attribute. You don't have to import this as a method like we did with things like ref, computed, and watch, where we had to import them from the Vue library. We don't have to do that with define prompts. It's just available. Which, as a footnote, that kind of drives me crazy. Like, why is this a particular macro that's global, whereas these other things have to be imported? Not really sure of the principles behind that, the advantages behind that. To me, it just makes it a little bit more confusing when you're learning about it to understand, okay, well, which methods do I have to import versus those that I don't? But anyway, I digress. That's a whole other thing. Takeaway here is just, this is how we set up our props. We just create a constant. Logically, I'm going to call it props. We use the define props macro, and then we can pass in an array of prop data that we're expecting this component to get. In this case, that's just a single prop called word. Then when we want to use it or reference it in our code, we're just going to reference it via the constant we created. So props dot, and then whatever the name of the property is, that'll give us access to that data. Now recall that props is how we pass information to our components. And then when we need to communicate data from our child components up to parent components, we emit events. And the syntax in the Composition API is we need to actually define what events we might want to emit. And we do that with another macro. This one, it's called define emits. And then again, we just give it an array of different events we might want to emit. And then the way that we can emit them is down here. We will just reference this emit constant we came up with, and then the name of the event. So if we compare this to how we did in the Options API, in my opinion, this actually gets a little bit more complicated, because back in the Options API, all we had to do is just reference this .emit, and then we could come up with whatever event name we wanted. We didn't have to register it ahead of time. But this additional step is necessary in the composition API, just based on how things are working behind the scenes. All right, so those are the two things to understand about child components and the composition APIs, just how to work with props and events. When it comes to using this child component and passing in props and receiving events, everything's going to stay the same there. If we go back to app.vue, if we look at word card, when we pass in the prop in our template, nothing changes there. Same thing with when we're listening for the increment correct count event. We're using the same syntax there. Nothing with any of these changes to the composition API has required any changes in the template itself. And with that, that's all I have to say about the composition API, at least in this beginner series. If you want to dig further into this, I do have some articles at the end of the notes that might be of interest. The first is to a FAQ in the Vue docs about the composition API. The second is an external article that talks about when you might want to use the composition API versus sticking with the options API. And both do a good job of just reiterating some of the points I was talking about at the beginning of the video when comparing these two different approaches. Looking beyond the composition API, though, and this series, in the next video, we're going to wrap things up. I have some useful tips I want to leave you with. I want to show you some web developer tools that are going to be really helpful when working with Vue applications. We're going to talk about some debugging tips, just some good wrap-up things to send you on your way. And speaking to that, I will also talk about what you might want to look at next beyond this series as you're continuing down your path of Vue development. To wrap up this series, I first want to recommend a developer extension tool you can add in your browser called Vue DevTools. This is a really handy utility to have at your disposal when working on Vue applications. To give you some insight of what it actually is, I have a screenshot here in the notes, but I can also show you in our FlashWord application. The way I'm going to get to it is I'm going to actually just open up my browser's web inspector panel. And then because I have this extension added, I have this additional tab Vue. And this is the Vue DevTools. Skimming through this interface, you can see all sorts of useful information. You have an outline of the Vue instances or the components within your application. And for each of them, you can see how you set that up. So you can see the data properties. You can see any watchers, computed properties that you created. All of that information's here. And then the other thing you'll see is as you're interacting with the interface and actually making changes, you'll see the data updated here. So you can kind of see what's happening behind the scenes. For example, if I enter a correct answer for this particular word card, you could see it dynamically filled in that data down here. If I hit enter, that should toggle correct to true. Right, so you can see that there. And that's just going to be really useful if you're working on an aspect of your application and things aren't working how you're expecting it. To be able to see the actual data behind the scenes can help sometimes get to the bottom of what the problem might be. Definitely something I recommend having installed and open whenever you're working on a Vue application. Coming back to the notes, the other thing I want to conclude this series with is just some general suggestions on where to go next. This has been a broad overview of Vue. We didn't really get into advanced details. We didn't cover every single detail about all of the techniques we looked at. So a good next step to follow up this series would be just to read through the official documentation that Vue provides. It's pretty good documentation. And it's one of those things, anytime you're learning a new technology, I always recommend giving a quick read through the entirety of the documentation, not with the intention of mastering or necessarily understanding everything, but just kind of preloading your brain with exposure to all the features that the technology provides, so that as you're developing and working, if you're trying to do something, you'll think, oh, I remember reading about that, or there was something related to this that I think could help in this situation. And then, of course, at that point, you would go back to the documentation and do like a closer read. But just getting that broad overview of what is provided is always a good place to start. Other points of reference, I have a link to the Vite documentation on building for production. So this is what you want to look at when you're ready to take your applications into the real world. You want to share them on a live server. Vite has build steps in there that will compile your application appropriately for that. So definitely a good next steps in terms of learning more about our Vite build system. Following that is a link to Vue Router, which is an official plugin for Vue that assists with making single-page applications. So these are websites where you have different pages, and rather than wanting to load the pages via a full request to the server, you can actually just dynamically load the content of that page within Vue and within JavaScript. So that's something I recommend if you're going beyond just building an interface portion of your application. You want the entire application and each of the individual pages to be powered by Vue. Check out Vue Router. Another kind of extension of Vue you might want to check out is something for state management. And where this is going to come in handy is as your applications grow in complexity and you're dealing with a lot of components that need to communicate data to one another, a state management system can help facilitate that. As we learned in this series, we can communicate data between components using things like events and props. But as the applications grow, that can get a little messy. So having a state management system in place can help with that. And Pinya is one particular plugin you can use with Vue. There are other options out there. So take a look around, do a little bit of research. But if you're looking for a good place to start with state management, I do recommend Pinya. Another topic I recommend digging into, and this is not specific to Vue, this is any sort of development you're doing, is just testing, right? So understanding how to write code that is testing your applications, ensuring that they are performing as expected, just so you have that quality assurance over time as you're evolving your application. And link here takes you over to a section in the Vue docs that just talks about testing in general and gives you some insight on what you should be looking at when it comes to testing specifically within Vue. And then the final thing you might want to check out is Nuxt.js. This is a framework built with Vue. And what this is going to provide is just some additional utilities and also just like a way of structuring your application based on some predefined patterns. It's going to help solve a lot of the pain points you might face when building Vue applications. Not something I recommend to start off with. I recommend getting comfortable with Vue in general first, but then if you really want to take things to the next level, if you're building a lot of websites with Vue, definitely might be worth investing some time in something like Nuxt.js. And with all of these advanced topics, definitely keep an eye out on my channel. Hopefully you will subscribe. I will be covering some of these topics in the future, building upon this foundational series. So there's still lots to learn, and I hope you will continue watching.